Picture this. While millions were lining up for Jaws and Star Wars, the most terrifying films of the decade were dying in empty theaters. These 15 supernatural horror masterpieces from the 1970s were buried by the blockbuster boom. Yet they make today's horror look like kids' cartoons. Number 15. Burnt Offerings, 1976. This psychological nightmare proves that Stephen King wasn't the only one who understood that houses could be evil. Karen Black and Oliver Reed star as a family renting a Victorian mansion for the summer, but the house demands something sinister in return. It feeds off human life force. The creepier the family gets, the more beautiful the house becomes. Director Dan Curtis knew exactly what he was doing, crafting sequences that Ty West would later steal wholesale for The House of the Devil. The film's production was haunted by strange accidents and unexplained equipment failures. Black herself claimed the house set felt genuinely malevolent during filming. Critics dismissed it as a cheap Exorcist knockoff, but audiences who caught it in theaters walked out genuinely disturbed. The movie's $4 million budget seemed huge until Jaws made $470 million that same year. Roger Ebert called it an effective horror film, but noted that timing was everything in Hollywood. The film vanished from theaters after just 3 weeks, crushed by summer blockbusters that promised thrills instead of genuine terror. Number 14. The Sentinel, 1977. Before Gateway to Hell became a horror cliché, this New York nightmare delivered the real deal. Christina Rains plays a model who rents a gorgeous Brooklyn Heights apartment, only to discover she's been chosen as the new guardian of a literal gateway to hell. What makes this film genuinely unsettling is director Michael Winner's decision to cast real-life people with physical disabilities as demons, creating imagery that still feels transgressive today. The film features an insane supporting cast, including Ava Gardner, Burgess Meredith, and a young Jeff Goldblum in one of his first roles. Winner spent months searching for the perfect Brooklyn Heights building, finally settling on one that residents claimed was actually haunted. The production was plagued by accidents, and several crew members reported feeling inexplicably ill during the hell sequences. Winner later admitted he may have pushed boundaries too far, but maintained that horror should genuinely horrify. Despite positive reviews from horror magazines, The Sentinel made only $9 million against a $3.5 million budget, completely overshadowed by Close Encounters of the Third Kind's $300 million haul. Number 13. Messiah of Evil, 1973. The husband-wife team behind American Graffiti and Howard the Duck made this before anyone knew their names, and it remains their most genuinely unsettling work. Mariana Hill drives to a coastal California town, searching for her missing artist father, only to find the entire population transforming into blood-weeping cannibals under the influence of an ancient sea cult. The film plays like Lovecraft, directed by Italian horror masters, with sequences so dreamlike they border on experimental art. Co-directors Willard Huyck and Gloria Katz shot this between writing drafts of American Graffiti, using leftover film stock and whatever locations they could afford. The movie's most famous sequence, set in a supermarket where normal shoppers gradually reveal themselves as cannibals, was filmed in a single night at a real grocery store. The film's electronic score, created by composer Philin Bishop, influenced countless horror synth soundtracks. Despite critical praise from Film Comment magazine, which called it one of the 10 most overlooked horror films of all time, Messiah of Evil made virtually no money during its original release. The film's copyright lapsed, making it public domain, which explains why it appeared in countless budget horror collections for decades. Number 12. House, 1977. Long before Sam Raimi discovered horror comedy, Japanese director Nobuhiko Obayashi created this absolute fever dream about 7 schoolgirls visiting a country house that literally devours them. Toho Studios asked Obayashi to make something like Jaws. Instead, he delivered a psychedelic nightmare where pianos eat fingers, cats shoot laser beams from their eyes, and severed heads bite ankles. The film plays like a children's cartoon directed during a complete mental breakdown. Obayashi involved his young daughter in creating the story, believing children understood fear better than adults. She suggested ideas like a house that eats girls and a watermelon that looks like a human head when pulled from a well. The film was shot using every experimental technique Obayashi could imagine: animation, matte paintings, and effects so deliberately artificial they become surreal. Japanese critics initially hated it, calling it incomprehensible nonsense. However, it became a massive hit with younger audiences who understood its pop art sensibilities. The film never received proper U.S. distribution until Criterion released it in 2010, over 30 years later. Janus Films estimated the movie lost Toho millions in potential overseas revenue simply because international distributors couldn't figure out how to market it. Number 11, The Other, 1972. Tom Tryon's adaptation of his own best-selling novel delivers one of the most disturbing evil child stories ever filmed. Set on a 1930s Connecticut farm, the film follows identical twins, Niles and Holland Perry, whose innocent games of astral projection, taught by their Russian grandmother, lead to a series of mysterious deaths. Director Robert Mulligan, fresh off Summer of '42, crafted something far darker than his previous wholesome dramas. The film features genuine, identical twins, Chris and Martin Udvarnoky, who never acted in another film. Their performances remain unnervingly authentic, partly because Mulligan encouraged them to stay in character between takes. Uta Hagen, the legendary acting teacher, delivers a career-defining performance as the grandmother who may be teaching the boys something far more dangerous than innocent games. The film's twist ending, revealed gradually through careful misdirection, remains one of horror's most effective. Despite positive reviews and Roger Ebert's 3-star rating, The Other made only $2 million against its $1.8 million budget. Tryon himself later disowned the film, claiming Mulligan's editing destroyed his carefully constructed narrative. The movie found new life on television throughout the 1970s, becoming a late-night staple that traumatized countless viewers. Number 10. Alice, Sweet Alice, 1976. This American giallo introduced the world to Brooke Shields while delivering one of the most unsettling child murder mysteries ever filmed. When 9-year-old Karen is strangled during her first communion, suspicion falls on her emotionally disturbed sister Alice, who wears a creepy translucent mask and yellow raincoat that would make any Italian horror director jealous. Director Alfred Sola crafted something that feels like Nicholas Roeg's Don't Look Now, reimagined as a religious psycho-thriller. The film was shot in Paterson, New Jersey, on a microscopic budget that forced Sola to use friends and family members in supporting roles. Paula Shepherd's performance as Alice remains genuinely chilling. Her dead-eyed stare and antisocial behavior feel disturbingly authentic. The movie's Catholic imagery and religious symbolism create an atmosphere of suffocating guilt and repression. Initially released as Communion, the film was later retitled Alice, Sweet Alice, to capitalize on Shields' rising fame. Despite critical praise and a devoted cult following, the film made barely $1 million during its initial release. The movie's most famous sequence, involving Alice's encounter with her obese, perverted landlord, was considered so disturbing that many theaters refused to book the film. Soule never directed another horror film, claiming the industry wasn't ready for truly disturbing content. Number 9. Let's Scare Jessica to Death, 1971. This psychological horror masterpiece follows a woman recovering from a nervous breakdown who moves to a remote Connecticut farmhouse, only to question her sanity when she begins seeing a mysterious woman in white. Director John Hancock created something that feels like a lost Gothic literature classic, with Zora Lampert delivering a performance that makes you genuinely unsure whether she's experiencing supernatural events or a complete mental collapse. The film was shot on location in an actual 19th century farmhouse that locals claimed was haunted. Several crew members reported strange occurrences during filming, including unexplained cold spots and equipment malfunctions. Lampert herself insisted something was watching her during the lake scenes, though nothing appeared on camera. The movie's deliberately ambiguous ending leaves viewers uncertain about what was real and what was imagined. Critics praised the film's psychological sophistication, but audiences expecting conventional scares were frustrated by its slow-burn approach. The movie made less than $500,000 during its initial release, far less than its $350,000 budget. Director Hancock later claimed that studio executives wanted him to add more explicit supernatural elements, but he refused to compromise his vision. The film found new appreciation in the 1980s when horror scholars recognized its influence on later psychological thrillers. Number 8. The Blood on Satan's Claw, 1971. British horror reached its peak with this folk horror masterpiece about a demonic presence corrupting an 18th century farming village. When a farmer unearths a skull with strange markings, the local children begin developing patches of fur and animalistic behavior, eventually forming a cult dedicated to resurrecting an ancient demon. Director Piers Haggard created something that feels like The Wicker Man's evil twin, with sequences of rural terror that remain genuinely disturbing. The film was produced by Tygon British Film Productions, which specialized in horror films designed to compete with Hammer Studios. The movie's practical effects, created by Roger Dickon, were considered groundbreaking for their time. The scenes of children transforming into demonic creatures were achieved using innovative makeup techniques that influenced later body horror films. Patrick Wymark's performance as the local judge provides the film's moral center, but even he cannot stop the spreading corruption. Despite critical acclaim from horror publications, the film was barely distributed in America, making less than $100,000 at U.S. box offices. The movie's themes of religious corruption and childhood innocence lost resonated with critics, but proved too disturbing for mainstream audiences. The film has since been recognized as a cornerstone of the folk horror subgenre, influencing everything from The Blair Witch Project to Midsommar. Number 7. The Night Stalker, 1972. This made-for-TV movie proved that television could deliver scares just as effectively as theatrical films. Darren McGavin plays Carl Kolchak, a Las Vegas reporter investigating a series of murders that seem to be the work of a vampire. Director John Llewellyn Moxey crafted something that feels like film noir crossed with Universal monster movies, creating a template for investigative horror that influenced The X-Files and countless other shows. The film was written by Richard Matheson, author of I Am Legend, who understood how to ground supernatural horror in realistic settings. McGavin's performance as the cynical reporter who gradually accepts the impossible makes the vampire threat feel genuinely dangerous. The movie's Las Vegas setting, with its neon-lit streets and seedy underbelly, provides the perfect backdrop for modern Gothic horror. The vampire, played by Barry Atwater, is genuinely frightening, avoiding the romantic interpretations that had dominated the character for decades. Despite being made for television, The Night Stalker attracted a massive audience of 54 million viewers, making it one of the most-watched TV movies ever. The film's success led to a sequel and a short-lived TV series, but the original remains the most effective. Critics praised the film's blend of horror and humor, noting that McGavin's wisecracks made the terror more effective by contrast. Number 6. Lamora, A Child's Tale of the Supernatural, 1973. This Southern Gothic nightmare follows a 13-year-old girl traveling through a plague-ravaged countryside to visit her father's mysterious female associate. Director Richard Blackburn created something that feels like a fever dream, with imagery so disturbing that the film was initially refused a rating by the MPAA. The movie's themes of lost innocence and sexual awakening are wrapped in supernatural terror that makes conventional horror look tame. The film was shot on a minuscule budget in rural locations that added to its authentic sense of decay and abandonment. Cheryl Smith's performance as the innocent Lila Lee navigates genuinely dangerous territory, both literally and figuratively. The movie's vampire-like creatures, known as Lemurians, are some of the most unsettling monsters ever created for a low-budget film. Blackburn spent years editing the film, creating a dreamlike narrative structure that defies conventional logic. The MPAA initially refused to rate the film due to its disturbing content involving a child protagonist, limiting its theatrical distribution. Despite critical praise from horror publications, Lemura made virtually no money during its original release. The film found new life in the 1980s when home video allowed audiences to discover its unique blend of art house sensibilities and exploitation horror. Many critics now consider it one of the most effective vampire films ever made, though its disturbing content ensures it remains controversial. Number 4. Theater of Blood, 1973. Vincent Price delivers his most delicious performance as a Shakespearean actor who fakes his death and returns to murder the critics who destroyed his career, using death scenes from Shakespeare's plays. Director Douglas Hickox created something that feels like Grand Guignol theater crossed with British comedy, allowing Price to choose scenery while delivering genuinely creative murder sequences based on the bard's most violent moments. Price reportedly considered this his favorite role, allowing him to combine his love of Shakespeare with his horror movie persona. The film's murder sequences, including death by stabbing, drowning in wine, and being fed to dogs, are both horrifying and darkly comic. Diana Rigg provides excellent support as Price's daughter, who helps orchestrate the elaborate revenge scheme. The movie's London locations and theatrical atmosphere create something that feels like a classic British thriller with supernatural undertones. Despite Price's star power and positive critical reviews, the film was overshadowed by bigger horror releases like The Exorcist. The movie made modest profits in Britain, but barely registered in American theaters, where audiences preferred more straightforward horror. Price himself campaigned for the film's recognition, considering it the perfect blend of his classical training and horror career. Critics praised the film's intelligence and Price's committed performance, noting that it elevated revenge horror beyond simple exploitation. Number 3. God Told Me To, 1976. Larry Cohen weaponized guerrilla filmmaking to create the most blasphemous horror film of the decade, and somehow got away with it. When random New Yorkers start committing mass murder while claiming God told me to, Detective Peter Nicholas investigates what appears to be divine madness, only to discover an alien-human hybrid posing as the second coming of Christ. Cohen shot much of this on New York streets without permits, including placing Andy Kaufman as a killer cop in an actual St. Patrick's Day parade. Cohen's script was so controversial that composer Miklos Rosa reportedly turned down the job, saying, "God told me not to." The film's most shocking reveal involves an alien entity with reproductive organs that look like nothing you've ever seen in a family film, leading to sequences that make The Exorcist look like Sunday school. Tony LoBianco delivers a powerhouse performance as the Catholic detective whose investigation forces him to question everything he believes about God, faith, and human nature. The film was shot for under $500,000, but feels like a $5 million production thanks to Cohen's resourceful use of real locations and authentic street footage. Bernard Herrmann was originally set to score the film before dying shortly after seeing the first cut. Despite marketing campaigns claiming religious leaders were forbidding audiences from seeing it, God Told Me to made barely $1 million during its original release, completely overshadowed by bigger horror films like The Omen. Critics who understood Cohen's vision praised it as his masterpiece, but mainstream audiences weren't ready for horror that questioned organized religion this directly. The film has since been recognized as one of the most audacious independent horror films ever made. Number 2. Salem's Lot, 1979. Tobe Hooper followed the Texas Chainsaw Massacre with this made-for-TV Stephen King adaptation that proved television could deliver legitimate scares. The film follows a writer returning to his hometown as vampires slowly take over the entire community. Hooper created something that feels like Invasion of the Body Snatchers crossed with classic Universal monster movies, turning small-town America into a vampire-infested nightmare. The film was shot as a 3-hour television miniseries, allowing Hooper to develop characters and build atmosphere in ways that theatrical horror films couldn't match. James Mason delivers a chilling performance as the mysterious antique dealer who may be serving darker masters. The movie's vampires, particularly Reggie Nalder's master vampire, Mr. Barlow, are genuinely frightening rather than romantic. Hooper's direction emphasizes creeping dread over graphic violence, creating terror through implication and atmosphere. Despite being made for television, the film attracted critical praise and massive audiences, proving that horror could work on the small screen. The movie's success led to a theatrical release in Europe, where it was recognized as a legitimate horror classic. Critics praised Hooper's ability to translate King's complex novel while maintaining the director's own visual style. The film influenced countless later vampire movies, but remains the most effective adaptation of King's work. These films prove that the best horror doesn't rely on jump scares or gore, but on genuine psychological terror that lingers long after the credits roll. While audiences chased blockbuster thrills, these directors created nightmares that make modern horror look like theme park rides. Which of these forgotten classics do you think deserves a modern remake? And more importantly, are we ready for horror this genuinely disturbing, or have we become too comfortable with safe scares? Let me know in the comments, because this debate is far from over. Imagine stepping into a darkened theater in the late 1970s, when horror was spiritual, slow-burning, and hauntingly poetic. Before jump scares ruled the genre, filmmakers dared to explore the unknown, the afterlife, possession, and cosmic dread. But as blockbusters like Jaws and Star Wars reshaped cinema, many supernatural masterpieces vanished into shadows. These are 15 more 1970s supernatural horror classics lost beneath Hollywood's booming spectacle. Number 15. The Legend of Hell House, 1973. When The Legend of Hell House premiered, it promised to outdo The Haunting with scientific precision and gothic menace. Adapted from Richard Matheson's novel, it told of physicists and mediums locked in the notorious Belasco Mansion, a haunted house so evil it seemed alive. Unlike its showier contemporaries, it was cerebral, almost clinical, dissecting belief and skepticism with chilling restraint. But here's the twist: audiences expecting cheap thrills were unnerved by its psychological stillness. Critics admired its intelligence but found it too cold, too British for mainstream crowds. American censors even trimmed its seance sequences, fearing the occult accuracy might inspire dangerous imitation. Behind the scenes, tension brewed. Director John Hoof clashed with producer James H. Nicholson over tone. Was it metaphysical horror or pure exploitation? Roddy McDowall's eerie calm only deepened the ambiguity. When the film faded from theaters, it lingered as an underground favorite among paranormal investigators and psychics who swore it got the details right. Decades later, it resurfaced on late-night cable, its sterile terror finding a new generation fascinated by haunted science. The Legend of Hell House wasn't just a ghost story, it was a mirror for humanity's obsession with proving the unprovable. Number 14. The Sentinel, 1977. On paper, The Sentinel looked like another exorcism knockoff, but beneath its studio polish lurked one of the most disturbing visions of heaven and hell ever filmed. The story follows Allison, a fashion model who moves into a Brooklyn brownstone guarded by a blind nun, only to discover the building is literally a gateway to hell. The film's climax, where real disfigured people were cast as demons, ignited outrage. Activists called it exploitative, critics called it obscene. Universal panicked, trimming key scenes before release, but the damage was done. Religious groups protested outside theaters, demanding it be pulled. Behind the camera, director Michael Winner courted controversy, boasting that real evil was captured on film. The production became chaotic, lights failed inexplicably, and extras fainted during the finale's infernal sequence. Some crews swore the church where they shot the exorcism scenes was later struck by lightning. Though it grossed modestly, the Sentinel was soon buried under Star Wars. Cheerful escapism. But time has turned it into a macabre relic, a film that dared to show damnation not as fire and brimstone, but as a neighbor's smile. It remains a quiet masterpiece about innocence, corrupted, and the terrible price of salvation. Number 13, The Changeling, 1979. George C. Scott had already won an Oscar when he signed on to The Changeling, a slow, mournful ghost story that traded gore for grief. The plot followed a widowed composer who moves into a mansion haunted by a murdered child. What begins as sorrowful piano notes soon unravels into revelations of greed, politics, and the silencing of the innocent. Audiences expecting shock were instead given melancholy. The atmosphere was thick with dread, but the horror lay in emotion, the ghost's sadness, not its violence. Critics loved its craftsmanship, but distributors struggled to market it amid the blockbuster craze. It was quietly pulled from several U.S. theaters after test audiences found it too depressing. Behind the scenes, whispers spread that the production itself was haunted. Crew members claimed instruments played when no one was near them. A prop wheelchair reportedly moved across the set unassisted, captured on 60mm film, then mysteriously lost. Over time, The Changeling grew into a cult legend, influencing modern ghost dramas from The Others to The Orphanage. Yet, unlike the jump scares that followed, it understood one eternal truth, that the dead don't always seek revenge. They seek remembrance. Number 12. Let's Scare Jessica to Death, 1971. When Let's Scare Jessica to Death premiered, audiences expected a low-budget vampire flick. What they got instead was a fragile psychological descent into paranoia. The story follows Jessica, a woman recently released from a mental institution who retreats to a quiet farmhouse with her friends only to encounter a mysterious drifter and strange, blood-drained bodies appearing in the lake. The film's horror is whispered, not screamed. Every sound, the rustle of trees, the echo of footsteps, the tremor in Jessica's voice, pulls you closer to her unraveling mind. Critics were divided. Some hailed it as avant-garde horror, others dismissed it as incoherent madness. The title promised cheap thrills, but the movie delivered existential terror. But here's the kicker. Paramount didn't know how to sell it. Posters screamed, "She's not insane," but they want her to think she is. Audiences expecting a slasher were bewildered by its ambiguity. The studio quietly withdrew it, and it vanished into late-night television rotations. Behind the scenes, the set was just as eerie. Lead actress Zora Lampert reportedly stayed in character, even off-camera, whispering lines to herself in dark corners. Some crew members believed the remote Connecticut farmhouse was genuinely haunted, equipment malfunctioned, and cold spots appeared in every room. Decades later, Let's Scare Jessica to Death would be rediscovered by horror scholars as an early feminist ghost story, a film about gaslighting, trauma, and sanity's fragile edges. Its influence can be felt in modern slow-burn horrors like The Witch and St. Maud. Forgotten by mainstream audiences, Jessica's quiet madness still echoes like a nightmare you can't wake from. Number 11. Burnt Offerings, 1976. Before The Shining haunted theaters, there was Burnt Offerings, a chilling precursor about a house that feeds on its residents. Directed by Dan Curtis and starring Oliver Reed, Karen Black and Bette Davis, the film follows a family who rents a decaying mansion for the summer, only to realize the house restores itself by draining the life of its occupants. Upon release, critics found it too methodical, too subdued compared to flashier horror of the era. Yet its slow corrosion of domestic normalcy made it unforgettable. Some claimed it symbolized the American dream turned predatory, consumerism devouring the soul. Behind the scenes, the production was equally cursed. Bette Davis feuded fiercely with her co-stars, allegedly calling the film evil. A stunt driver died in a freak accident days after wrapping. Even Karen Black later said, "That house didn't just look alive, it felt alive." Though it earned modest box office returns, Burnt Offerings was buried under the spectacle of Jaws and The Omen. But decades later, horror fans rediscovered it as a forgotten gem, a film that understood the quiet terror of being consumed by comfort itself. Its final shot of a woman becoming one with the walls remains one of cinema's most chilling metaphors for domestic doom. Number 10. The Brotherhood of Satan, 1971. In an era obsessed with youth culture, the Brotherhood of Satan turned the lens on the elderly and found horror in the most unthinkable place. The story begins with a small town cut off from the outside world, where families vanish and dolls appear in their place. A local priest uncovers a satanic cult of aging citizens, transferring their souls into children's bodies to escape death. Released in the wake of Rosemary's Baby, it promised another occult thriller, but confused audiences with its slow pacing and surreal tone. Columbia Pictures, unsure how to market it, buried it in drive-ins. Critics dismissed it as derivative, but others recognized its boldness, a grim reflection on generational decay and the fear of mortality. The production faced chaos. Budget cuts forced director Bernard McKevety to reuse sets and props from Bewitched and Bonanza, giving the movie an uncanny, half-sitcom atmosphere. Actors reported bizarre coincidences, scenes of possession coinciding with sudden temperature drops, malfunctioning projectors, and one camera reportedly exploding during a seance scene. Over time, the Brotherhood of Satan became a cult favorite among occult film scholars. Its message of a world where the old devour the young to preserve their legacy feels eerily prophetic. In an age obsessed with eternal youth, this forgotten nightmare warns that immortality always demands a sacrifice. Number 9. The Haunting of Julia, 1977. Also known as Full Circle, The Haunting of Julia was a psychological horror built from heartbreak. Starring Mia Farrow, it followed a grieving mother who moves into a London townhouse after her daughter's tragic death. But as the days pass, Julia begins to sense another child's presence, a ghostly girl with a darker secret than she ever imagined. When released, the film was overshadowed by louder supernatural hits like The Exorcist and The Omen. Audiences wanted spectacle. Julia offered silence, grief, and emotional terror. Critics praised Farrow's delicate performance, but called the film too quiet to scare. In the United States, distributors barely released it. Some theaters even misprinted its title as Haunting Julia, confusing audiences. Behind the scenes, the production was as cursed as its story. Equipment reportedly malfunctioned during emotional scenes, and Farrow herself claimed to have felt watched on set. Director Richard Loncraine later confessed that strange technical failures seemed to follow them from location to location, as if the film's ghost refused to stay fictional. Over time, The Haunting of Julia gained recognition as one of the most haunting depictions of parental loss ever filmed. Its mood of creeping melancholy inspired later ghost dramas like The Sixth Sense and the others. Lost amid blockbuster noise, Julia endures as a whisper of sorrow, the kind of story that doesn't scream, it lingers. Number 8. The Car, 1977. Before Christine and Maximum Overdrive, there was The Car, a desert-set horror about a driverless black sedan terrorizing a small Utah town. It was both ridiculous and terrifying, a cross between Jaws and The Exorcist on four wheels. Critics laughed, audiences screamed. But the real horror came not from the steel beast, but from the idea that evil itself could take mechanical form. Universal marketed it as an action thriller, but religious groups protested. Some claimed the film promoted satanic imagery, with the car's horn likened to a demonic laugh. The film was briefly pulled in several southern states after churches called it blasphemous. Behind the scenes, real-life accidents unnerved the cast. A stunt driver narrowly escaped death when the vehicle veered off course during a chase sequence. Even the car's design, built from a modified Lincoln Continental, was rumored to have been blessed by a priest before filming. Just in case. Initially dismissed as B-movie nonsense, the car has since achieved cult status. It predicted our modern fear of technology's autonomy decades before self-driving cars existed. Beneath its absurd premise lies a terrifying question. What if evil doesn't need a soul? It only needs wheels? Number 7. The Other, 1972. In the shadow of The Exorcist, few remember The Other, a masterfully unsettling story about twin boys on a rural farm during the Great Depression. One is kind and gentle, the other isn't. Adapted from Tom Tryon's novel, it's a chilling meditation on innocence, guilt, and the monstrous games children play when no one is watching. Audiences in 1972 weren't prepared for such subtle evil. Director Robert Mulligan, known for To Kill a Mockingbird, traded sentiment for dread. The horror unfolds in daylight, through laughter, family picnics, and whispered secrets. No monsters, no jump scares, only a boy's smile concealing something terrible. Censors struggled to categorize it. Some theaters rated it R for psychological cruelty, while others gave it a mild PG. The result was box office confusion, and the film disappeared quickly despite critical praise. Mulligan himself was heartbroken, calling it his most misunderstood work. Behind the scenes, the young twin actors were reportedly shielded from the script's darker implications. But crew members claimed that after filming, one twin refused to speak about the experience ever again. Rediscovered in recent years, The Other now stands as one of the decade's most haunting explorations of identity and repressed trauma. It doesn't rely on gore or demons, just the chilling thought that evil can wear the face of a child. Number 6. The Devil's Reign, 1975. Few films captured the bizarre blend of celebrity and occult like The Devil's Reign. Starring William Shatner, Ernest Borgnine, and a young John Travolta, it was part satanic ritual, part surreal nightmare. The story follows a family cursed by a centuries-old pact hunted by a cult that worships the devil himself in a dusty western ghost town. At the time, it was marketed as a mainstream horror thrill ride, but audiences got something far stranger. The film's melting face finale became infamous, a 10-minute sequence of bubbling wax corpses disintegrating into pools of sludge. Religious groups called it a grotesque blasphemy. The Vatican even reportedly condemned it for spreading satanic imagery under the guise of entertainment. Behind the scenes, things got weirder. Anton LaVey, founder of the Church of Satan, served as technical advisor, insisting that the rituals in the film be performed authentically. Cast members later said they feared the set was cursed, crew equipment malfunctioned, and one actor claimed his car exploded after filming Wrapped. Critics called The Devil's Reign nonsensical, but its bizarre sincerity gave it lasting power. Over time, it became a cult relic, beloved by fans of occult cinema and retro weirdness. In its melting, screaming faces, viewers saw a reflection of 70's paranoia, a time when faith, fear, and entertainment blurred into one unholy mass. Number 5. Suspiria, 1977. When Suspiria premiered, it shocked audiences not through gore, but through vision and sound. A young ballet student arrives at a prestigious European dance academy, only to discover the school hides a coven of witches. Dario Argento's film is a feverish dream of color, ritual, and dread. Its apartment hallways bleed red, shadows twist, and every step is an invocation. Initially, critics were divided. Some dismissed it as style over substance, yet the film's hypnotic power gradually clawed its way into the horror canon. Its score by Goblin became as iconic as its imagery. Over time, Suspiria's influence rippled through modern horror, inspiring filmmakers to treat fear as art rather than shock. Behind the scenes, the production was a maelstrom of visual experiments and tonal boldness. Argento often pushed actors beyond comfort, lighting sets with unconventional filters and layering dream logic into every frame. Today, Suspiria stands not just as a film, but as an experience, an occult ritual, a dance of terror, and one of the most enduring supernatural horrors of the 1970s. Number 4. The Manitou, 1978. By the late 70s, horror was turning cosmic, and the Manitou embraced that madness with both arms. Based on Graham Masterton's novel, it told the story of a woman who grows a strange tumor on her back, only to discover it's the reincarnating fetus of an ancient Native American shaman. What follows is a battle between science, spirit, and cosmic horror that defies logic. The premise alone shocked audiences. Critics mocked it as absurd, but the film's sincerity and bizarre visuals, floating hospitals, chanting rituals, laser battles between spiritual forces, gave it a hypnotic edge. The film was banned in several European countries for blasphemy and racial insensitivity, though Masterton defended it as a metaphor for cultural revenge. Behind the scenes, chaos reigned. Star Tony Curtis reportedly clashed with director William Girdler, who died in a helicopter crash months before the film's release. Some crew members later swore the production had been cursed. Several props used in the ritual scenes mysteriously disappeared after filming wrapped. Although the Manitou flopped upon release, it became a cult favorite in the VHS era. Its blend of spiritual horror and pulpy sci-fi feels strangely prophetic now, anticipating the metaphysical tone of later horror classics like Event Horizon and The Ring. It stands as a bizarre reminder that sometimes the most frightening horrors are born from the clash of ancient faith and modern arrogance. Number 3. The Visitor, 1979. If The Exorcist was theological terror, The Visitor was cosmic chaos. An Italian-American co-production directed by Giulio Paradisi, it merged biblical prophecy, alien intervention, and psychic warfare into something utterly unique and nearly incomprehensible. The film follows an interdimensional battle between good and evil, centered around a young girl whose powers could alter the fate of humanity. At release, critics called it a schizophrenic blend of The Omen, Close Encounters, and 2001, A Space Odyssey. It was banned in several European territories for religious blasphemy and occult symbolism, with censors citing its depiction of Christ-like aliens and avian demigods. American audiences, already captivated by Lucas and Spielberg, dismissed it as incoherent madness. Behind the scenes, the production was as chaotic as the film itself. Filming was halted twice for financial reasons, and rewrites were reportedly done overnight in hotel lobbies. Yet the film's ambition was undeniable. It featured legendary actors, John Huston, Shelley Winters, and Glenn Ford, performing against psychedelic visuals and sound design that felt closer to a fever dream than a horror movie. For years, The Visitor vanished, its prints forgotten, its legacy whispered about among cult cinephiles. But in the 2010s, it was rediscovered and restored, hailed as one of the most audacious supernatural experiments of the decade. Beneath its madness lies a warning about humanity's craving for divine control, and the chaos unleashed when mortals play gods. Number 2. The Night Stalker, 1972. Before Halloween or The X-Files, there was The Night Stalker. Originally a television film produced by Dan Curtis, it starred Darren McGavin as Carl Kolchak, a rumpled Las Vegas reporter investigating a series of bizarre murders. The twist? The killer was a real vampire hiding in modern America. The film terrified audiences, becoming the most-watched TV movie in U.S. history. But network executives panicked. ABC received complaints from religious groups, parents, and even city officials claiming the movie promoted hysteria. Some regions refused to re-air it, claiming it caused panic among children. Behind the scenes, the network fought constant censorship battles. The original script was darker. Kolchak's encounters with corruption and disbelief mirrored real-world paranoia about media and government. Producer Dan Curtis trimmed entire subplots to appease the network, while McGavin fought to preserve its cynical tone. Its success inspired a sequel and the cult TV series Kolchak, The Night Stalker, which in turn influenced The X-Files decades later. Yet despite its legacy, it was largely forgotten in the age of theatrical blockbusters. The Night Stalker proved something radical for its time, that horror didn't need grand sets or gore. Sometimes the scariest monsters hide in plain sight, and the only weapon left is truth itself. 3. Few films embody the supernatural artistry of the 70s as a psychological drama descends into a labyrinth of fate, prophecy, editing, eerie imagery, and ambiguous timeline shattered narrative convention. Yet its ending, a shocking, fatal twist, divided. Scenes were shot in near-freezing conditions. Whispers on set spoke of bad luck haunting the production. Sutherland later admitted he never mastered and is now studied for its layered symbolism. Its venom stands as the perfect summation of 70s supernatural cinema. Intelligent, a film not about ghosts, but about the impossible task of letting go. In the shadow of the blockbuster era, these haunting masterpieces vanished. These forgotten 70s horrors should rise again. Like, comment, and while audiences were stampeding toward spaceships and giant sharks, another breed of film was quietly being buried alive. The 1,970 seconds didn't just belong to Star Wars and Jaws. Hidden beneath those cultural earthquakes were nightmares that twisted reality, warped the imagination, and left scars you can still feel. These were supernatural horror films that never got their full moment in the spotlight. Want to see what got lost while Hollywood was chasing billion-dollar dreams? Let's pull them back from the shadows. Equinox 1970. Before Sam Raimi unleashed The Evil Dead, a scrappy little project called Equinox was already experimenting with demons in the woods. This wasn't a slick studio release. It was cobbled together by college students and effects artists who worshipped Ray Harryhausen. The result? A story about teenagers stumbling onto an ancient book that opens a portal to another realm, unleashing monsters, winged creatures, and chaos. Sound familiar? Yeah, it's basically The Evil Dead blueprint, 10 years early. Equinox is clunky, sure. The acting wobbles, and the plot sometimes feels stitched together with duct tape. But what makes it legendary is the handmade monster magic. Stop-motion demons crawl out of the earth, clay gargoyles stomp across the screen. You can see the fingerprints on the models, and that's exactly what makes it charming. It's like watching kids play with horror toys and somehow convincing a distributor to put it on screens. Behind the chaos was Dennis Muren, a young visual effects genius who later became one of George Lucas's secret weapons at Industrial Light and Magic. The man who helped bring Star Wars to life first cut his teeth animating low-budget demons for Equinox. Critics at the time didn't know what to do with it. Was it amateur hour or was it underground brilliance? Audiences who stumbled into drive-ins often left scratching their heads but never forgot those bizarre monsters. Equinox didn't make money, but its DNA seeped into horror history. Today, it's a cult film preserved by Criterion, a reminder that sometimes the weird little experiments leave a bigger mark than the blockbusters. The Dunwich Horror, 1970. When a movie opens with ominous chanting and Dean Stockwell glaring like he knows every secret you don't, you know you're in for something strange. The Dunwich Horror, adapted loosely from H.P. Lovecraft, is a swirling fever dream of occult weirdness and small-town paranoia. It pairs Sandra Dee, America's squeaky-clean sweetheart, with Stockwell playing a mysterious young man obsessed with forbidden rituals. The setup is classic horror. A sleepy New England town, whispers of inbreeding and strange births, and a crumbling mansion filled with whispers and locked doors. But what really sells the mood is Stockwell himself. With his wild hair, velvet voice, and glassy stare, he doesn't even need monsters around him to be terrifying. He looks like he could summon something just by blinking. The effects are dated, no question. Painted skies, swirling lights, and rubbery creatures push the limits of what could be done at the time. But the atmosphere is thick with dread. The story centers on a family tied to ancient rituals, hinting at things too big and too dark for humans to handle. Even with its low budget, it manages to capture Lovecraft's sense of things you shouldn't see. What makes the Dunwich Horror fascinating now is how it straddles eras. It's stuck halfway between Gothic horror and the modern supernatural boom. The movie never became a hit. It was swallowed up at the box office by flashier fare, leaving it to rot on late-night TV. But ask any fan of Lovecraft on film, and they'll point to this as an early attempt to bottle cosmic unease. It may not be perfect, but it's proof that the 70 seconds were trying to tap into horror far older and stranger than the blockbusters dared. Cry of the Banshee, 1970. Vincent Price. That name alone should make your horror senses tingle. In Cry of the Banshee, he plays a ruthless magistrate in Elizabethan England who delights in hunting down anyone he deems a witch. Price is in full sneering mode, reveling in cruelty, until the tables turn when he crosses a real coven with powers beyond his comprehension. This is Gothic horror turned feral. Unlike the polite chillers of the 60 seconds, Cry of the Banshee feels dirty, raw, and almost cursed. Director Gordon Hessler leaned into atmosphere. Misty moors, candlelit chambers, and a town that seems to rot from the inside out. When the Banshee's curse is unleashed, it doesn't arrive as a polite ghost. It slithers into the community, manifesting through possession and terrifying visions. Price is, of course, the jewel here. Even when saddled with melodramatic dialogue, he delivers it like Shakespeare dipped in poison. His scenes of power and eventual downfall carry the entire film. The supernatural angle is both eerie and tragic, portraying vengeance as unstoppable once it takes root. Cry of the Banshee didn't stand a chance against the tidal wave of new horror tastes sweeping the decade. Hammer Studios was fading, American blockbusters were rising, and this strange blend of Gothic and occult fell between the cracks. Yet, decades later, its imagery lingers. The Banshee's chilling presence, Price's aristocratic cruelty, and the bleakness of a world where curses never end cleanly. It's not the most polished horror film of the 70 seconds, but it's a vital relic of the genre's shift from elegant to savage. Season of the Witch, 1972, George A. Romero will forever be tied to the living dead, but before Dawn of the Dead, he slipped in a little-known supernatural tale that's as unsettling as it is strange. Season of the Witch, sometimes re-released under different titles, follows a suburban woman trapped in the suffocating routine of housework and dull marriage. Her escape? A dive into witchcraft and rituals that may or may not actually be real. This isn't broomsticks and pointed hats. Romero treated witchcraft as a lens to explore identity, frustration, and power. His lead character drifts between dream sequences, bizarre visions, and ritual scenes that feel both sinister and liberating. The supernatural in this film is never clearly explained, and that's exactly why it works. You're left wondering, is she unlocking hidden forces or just cracking under pressure? Romero shot it on a shoestring budget in Pittsburgh, using real homes and local actors. That grit gives the movie its bite. It doesn't feel like Hollywood magic. It feels like someone peeled back the wallpaper in suburbia and found something festering underneath. The surreal dream sequences, masked figures, shadowy corridors, disembodied voices make you question reality right alongside the main character. At the time, critics didn't know what to do with it. Was it horror? Was it social commentary? Audiences shrugged, and it quietly disappeared. But now it's often cited as a precursor to modern psychological horror, where the supernatural becomes tangled with personal breakdowns. Season of the Witch may not have blockbuster gloss, but it has something better, a willingness to dive into discomfort and blur the line between haunting and self-discovery. It's Romero reminding us that true horror often lurks in the ordinary. The Possession of Joel Delaney, 1972. Imagine Shirley MacLaine in a role so grim it shocked audiences who expected her usual light touch. The Possession of Joel Delaney is a film that hits you with unease from the very first scene. MacLaine plays a wealthy Manhattan woman whose younger brother begins acting strangely. His behavior spirals into something terrifying as she realizes he may be inhabited by a force she can't control. The film drips with 70 seconds urban tension. Forget haunted castles, this horror unfolds in the grit of New York apartments and streets. What makes it so unnerving is how ordinary everything looks while extraordinary evil creeps in. Perry King, as Joel, delivers a performance that swings from charming to horrifying, making the possession angle disturbingly believable. Director Waris Hussein didn't go for special effects fireworks. Instead, he let performances carry the terror. Simple gestures, strange stares, sudden outbursts, moments of eerie calm become scarier than monsters. It's horror that feels personal, intimate, and claustrophobic. The supernatural isn't a faraway concept here. It's in your living room, sitting across from you, smiling like someone you used to trust. At its release, the film struggled to find a wide audience. Blockbusters drowned it out, and critics called it too disturbing for mainstream viewers. Over time, though, it developed a reputation as one of the decade's most chilling supernatural dramas. It's not just about possession, it's about what happens when safety and family ties crumble in the face of something you can't explain. The Possession of Joel Delaney is a reminder that horror doesn't need flashy effects. Sometimes all it takes is one actor slowly unraveling and a sister forced to watch helplessly. That's a nightmare you can't shake. The Legend of Hell House, 1973. Before haunted house movies became CGI roller coasters, The Legend of Hell House showed how to do terror with style. Written by Richard Matheson, the same man behind I Am Legend, this is a film dripping with menace. A group of investigators enters the infamous Belasco house, nicknamed the Mount Everest of haunted houses, to prove whether the afterlife exists. What they get instead is a barrage of attacks from forces that do not want them there. The house itself is the star. Every corridor seems to breathe, every shadow hides something waiting to pounce. Roddy McDowall plays a medium who's already scarred by a previous encounter with the mansion, and his tension infects every scene. Each character is pushed to their breaking point, mentally and physically, as the house digs into their fears. What sets this apart is its mix of science and the supernatural. Electrodes and machines are set up like a lab, but no technology can explain what lashes out from the walls. The violence isn't splashy, it's psychological, with moments of sudden, shocking impact. It's the kind of film that convinces you an empty room isn't really empty. Overshadowed by The Exorcist and other big names, The Legend of Hell House didn't make blockbuster waves, but horror fans have kept it alive. Its atmosphere, intensity, and refusal to give easy answers make it one of the most enduring haunted house films of its era. If you think haunted houses are cliches, this is the one that still bites. Symptoms, 1974. Now here's a ghost story that nearly vanished for good. Symptoms, a British chiller, competed at the Cannes Film Festival in 1974 and then disappeared into obscurity for decades. The film follows a fragile young woman who invites a friend to a country mansion. As the days pass, whispers of past tragedy seep through the walls, and the house's isolation begins to weigh heavily. But the real question becomes, is the haunting in the building or in her mind. Director José Ramón Larraz crafted something delicate and disturbing. The film thrives on mood rather than shocks. Endless hallways, foggy lakes, and silent rooms create a sense of unease that never lets up. Angela Pleasance delivers a performance that's both vulnerable and chilling. Her pale features and soft voice make you lean in, only to jolt back when the darkness surfaces. For years, Symptoms was considered a lost film, surviving only in fading memories and battered reels. When it was finally restored in the 2010 seconds, horror fans rediscovered a hidden gem. Unlike the louder horrors of its decade, this one whispers, and sometimes whispers are more frightening than screams. It never had a chance to compete against blockbuster spectacle. But now, with its haunting beauty restored, Symptoms proves that quiet horror can linger longer than the loudest scares. The Devil's Reign, 1975. Imagine William Shatner, Ernest Borgnine, and a very young John Travolta trapped in a story about cursed families and unholy rituals. That's The Devil's Reign, a film so bizarre it almost feels like a dare. It opens with desert landscapes and thunderclouds that never leave, setting the mood for a tale about a stolen book of dark power and the curse it unleashes. The story is simple. A family plagued by a centuries-old curse faces off against a cult determined to claim their souls. The hook, though, is the film's surreal visuals. Victims melt into waxy puddles in scenes that still look grotesque today. The final act is a non-stop barrage of dissolving faces, boiling skin, and chaos that feels both dated and strangely hypnotic. Ernest Borgnine leans into the role of cult leader with a performance that goes from theatrical to monstrous, quite literally, as his features transform in the climax. Shatner, meanwhile, plays it straight, grounding the madness with a surprising amount of grit. The Devil's Reign was dismissed on release as campy nonsense, but over time it became a cult treasure. Its melting face finale alone has been referenced in countless retrospectives. It's not refined, but it's unforgettable. Overshadowed at the time by slicker films, this one stands today as a piece of horror oddity that refuses to be ignored. It's messy, it's wild, and it's a ride you'll never forget. Ruby, 1977. What happens when you mix mobster ghosts with drive-in culture? You get Ruby, a supernatural horror starring Piper Laurie, fresh off her unforgettable role in Carrie. Here, she plays the widow of a gangster who runs a shabby drive-in theater. But when the anniversary of her husband's death rolls around, the past comes knocking literally. His ghost begins haunting her and her staff, demanding vengeance. The setting is genius. A drive-in theater, already a fading cultural icon in the late 70s seconds, becomes a stage for supernatural retribution. Projectors jam, reels melt, and cars full of teenagers turn into unwilling witnesses. Piper Laurie carries the film, delivering a performance that blends glamour, bitterness, and barely concealed fear. The supernatural force manifests in strange, eerie ways. Disembodied voices, flickering lights, and sudden acts of violence that feel like messages from beyond. The low budget shows, but that grit gives Ruby its charm. It feels like a horror film born right out of America's changing entertainment landscape, where drive-ins themselves were ghosts of a dying era. Ruby didn't make much noise in theaters, but it later found an audience on television and home video. Today, it stands as a forgotten supernatural gem that dared to place its horrors not in castles or graveyards, but in the neon glow of a drive-in lot. A movie about hauntings inside a theater where people watched movies. It doesn't get more meta than that. Suspiria, 1977. If horror films are nightmares, Suspiria is the one that refuses to let you wake up. Directed by Dario Argento, this Italian masterpiece follows a young dancer who enrolls in a prestigious ballet academy, only to discover it's hiding a sinister force. From the moment she steps off the plane into a storm of red light and thunder, you know this isn't ordinary horror. Suspiria is famous for its colors. Neon blues, blood reds, glowing greens, every frame looks like a painting that wants to eat you alive. Goblin's pounding score adds to the madness, with music so relentless it feels like the walls themselves are screaming. The story is deceptively simple, but the execution turns it into an operatic fever dream. The film's supernatural horrors aren't just about witches in the shadows, they're about atmosphere swallowing you whole. Doors slam shut. For no reason, shadows dance across ceilings, and death scenes play out like twisted ballets. It's over the top, yes, but that's exactly why it works. When Suspiria hit theaters, some critics called it nonsense. Others called it genius. Audiences were split, but one thing was certain: no one forgot it. Overshadowed in box office numbers by bigger, safer films, Suspiria instead carved out a legacy as one of the greatest supernatural horrors ever made. Today it's studied, restored, and endlessly copied. Argento's nightmare vision proved that horror didn't need realism. It needed style that hit you like a sledgehammer. And Suspiria delivers style in every terrifying frame. Alucarda, 1977. Some films feel like they were beamed in from another dimension, and Alucarda is one of them. Shot in Mexico and directed by Juan López Moctezuma, this is a supernatural explosion of hysteria, possession, and raw chaos. It begins with a young orphan, Justine, who is sent to a convent. There, she meets the mysterious Alucarda, a girl with a wild stare and an energy that doesn't belong to this world. From their first meeting, the story spirals into frenzy. Whispers of curses, strange rituals, and unexplainable visions cascade into outright pandemonium. The convent is overrun with screaming, exorcisms, and supernatural energy that feels like it might burst through the screen. There's very little calm in this film. It runs at fever pitch almost from the opening and doesn't let go. The visuals are unforgettable. Hooded figures, blood-red cloaks, and candlelit rooms feel almost like moving paintings. The performances match the chaos, with Alucarda herself shifting between childlike innocence and feral intensity. The movie's atmosphere is less about scares in the traditional sense and more about overwhelming you with sheer force. When it first appeared, audiences didn't know what to make of it. Too wild for mainstream theaters and too intense for casual viewers, it slipped into obscurity. But horror devotees have since embraced it as one of the boldest supernatural films of the decade. It's messy, shocking, and unapologetically strange, but that's exactly why it endures. Alucarda isn't a gentle ghost story. It's a hurricane of supernatural chaos, and once you've seen it, you'll never forget it. Phantasm, 1979. Few films capture the surreal spirit of 70 seconds horror like Phantasm. Directed by Don Coscarelli, this film doesn't play by any rules. It introduces us to the Tall Man, a funeral home director with an otherworldly presence, and his arsenal of nightmare imagery. Floating spheres drill through halls, coffins lead to portals, and the dead don't stay dead for long. The story follows a young boy who suspects something sinister at the local mortuary. Alongside his brother and a loyal friend, he stumbles into a dimension-spanning plot that turns small-town America into a surreal battlefield. Every scene in Phantasm feels like a dream, sometimes lucid, sometimes slipping into pure nightmare logic. What makes it stand out is its blend of Americana and cosmic horror. One moment, you're in a familiar graveyard, and the next, you're staring at hooded dwarfs being forced through a glowing portal. It's bizarre, it's bold, and it's unforgettable. The Tall Man, played by Angus Scrimm, became an instant horror icon. His towering frame and booming "booey" sent chills through anyone watching. Phantasm wasn't a major studio release. It was a low-budget gamble that turned into a cult sensation. Critics didn't know whether to laugh or scream, but audiences who found it in drive-ins and video stores spread its legend. Overshadowed at the time by Hollywood blockbusters, Phantasm carved its own lane. It's a surreal trip into death, dreams, and dread. Even today, it feels unique, like someone bottled a nightmare and projected it onto a screen. Bloodthirst, 1971. If you thought all supernatural horror came out of Europe or Hollywood, think again. Bloodthirst was made in the Philippines, and it's a striking blend of local legend and pulpy horror. The story follows an American detective sent to Manila to investigate a series of strange killings. What he finds isn't a conventional villain, it's a creature from folklore, a vampire-demon hybrid that preys in the shadows. Shot in moody black and white, even in the 70 seconds, the film has an eerie, timeless quality. The humid night streets of Manila become the perfect backdrop for a story about lurking danger. Unlike glossy Hollywood productions, Bloodthirst feels raw, grounded, and genuinely unsettling. The supernatural creature, though created with minimal effects, exudes a presence that lingers long after the credits. What sets it apart is its cultural context. By mixing noir detective tropes with local mythology, Bloodthirst created something that stood out from the wave of American horror flooding the decade. It's a reminder that horror doesn't belong to one country, it's universal, shaped by the fears of each culture. The film never made it big in USA theaters, but it found life in grindhouse circuits and late-night TV slots. Viewers stumbled onto it expecting pulp thrills and instead got a dose of supernatural unease. For years, it circulated in bootleg prints, gaining a reputation as a forgotten gem. Today, it's not just a curiosity, it's a crucial piece of horror history. Bloodthirst proves that even on the fringes, the 70 seconds were experimenting with supernatural terror in ways Hollywood blockbusters never dared. Black Belly of the Tarantula, 1971. Italian horror in the 70 seconds was its own wild universe, and Black Belly of the Tarantula sits at a fascinating crossroads. On the surface, it's a giallo thriller about a detective chasing a killer. But layered through the mystery are elements of psychic dread and eerie visions that give the whole thing a supernatural edge. The film is packed with tension. Victims are paralyzed by a strange method and left helpless while their fate plays out. The detective, played with brooding intensity by Giancarlo Giannini, wades through a maze of suspects, psychic warnings, and sinister imagery. The result is a thriller that constantly feels like it's teetering into the realm of the uncanny. Visually, the movie is stunning. Italian directors of the era had a flair for turning violence into art, and this film is no exception. Bold camera moves, vivid colors, and surreal close-ups keep you off balance. The score, by Ennio Morricone, doesn't just accompany the action, it slithers into your head, amplifying the dread. At the time, it was lumped in with dozens of giallo thrillers and didn't stand out at the box office. But in hindsight, its blend of mystery and supernatural unease makes it unique. It's not just about a killer on the loose, it's about the creeping sense that reality itself is warping. Black Belly of the Tarantula may not be as famous as Suspiria or Deep Red, but it's a perfect example of how Italian horror blurred the line between mystery and the supernatural. Watch it once, and those paralyzed stares will haunt you. Torso 1973. On paper, Torso looks like a straightforward thriller, a killer stalking college students in Italy. Sounds like familiar giallo territory. But dig deeper, and you find a film laced with supernatural overtones and a sense of dread that feels almost psychic. Directed by Sergio Martino, Torso starts as a crime mystery and then gradually slides into something darker, stranger, and more atmospheric than audiences expected. The story centers on a group of students retreating to an isolated villa after a string of killings. But instead of safety, they walk into a trap. The film builds tension through silence, shadows, and eerie close-ups that suggest forces at play beyond just a masked figure. Some sequences feel less like a murder mystery and more like a waking nightmare, where the walls themselves seem to lean in. What makes Torso memorable is its mood. The final act plays out with long stretches of near silence as one survivor tiptoes through the villa, trying not to breathe too loudly. It's suffocating suspense, heightened by moments that feel almost supernatural in their intensity. At the time, Torso was dismissed as another violent thriller. Overshadowed by Argento's flashier films, it didn't make much noise outside Italy, but in retrospect, it's a crucial bridge between giallo and the supernatural horrors that dominated later in the decade. Torso isn't just about danger, it's about the feeling that reality has tilted. And once that feeling creeps in, you can't shake it. So there you have it. 15 more supernatural nightmares from the 70 seconds that slipped through the cracks while blockbusters hogged the spotlight. These weren't safe, polished crowd pleasers. They were bold, strange, and sometimes messy, but always unforgettable. Which one do you think deserves a modern re-release, or even a remake? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like, and subscribe if you want more hidden gems pulled out of the shadows. Because trust me, the 70 seconds still have plenty of ghosts left to uncover. Think the 1960s were all flower power, spy flicks, and swinging London comedies? Think again. Beneath the bright lights and Beatles buzz, a dark current of supernatural horror was bubbling up, films that terrified audiences before the blockbuster machine buried them under spectacle. Ghosts, witches, cursed skulls, and haunted houses roared across screens, but most were pushed aside by big-budget spectacles. Ready to uncover the eerie gems that time nearly erased? Let's dive in. The City of the Dead Horror Hotel, 1960. Imagine a New England town where the fog never lifts, the locals never smile, and the church bells toll for someone who hasn't died yet. That's the chilling world of The City of the Dead, released in the U.S. as Horror Hotel. Christopher Lee sets the stage as a professor who sends a student off to research witchcraft, only for her to vanish in a town still clinging to ancient pacts. Shot on a shoestring budget in England but masquerading as small-town America, the film squeezes every drop of atmosphere from its mist-drenched sets. Director John Llewellyn-Moxey drenches Whitewood in shadows so thick they feel alive. The cemetery scenes, filmed with clever lighting tricks, make the ground itself seem like it's breathing. And that inn? Every squeaking floorboard feels like a warning. What makes Horror Hotel unforgettable isn't just the gothic look, but its boldness. Killing off the apparent lead halfway through shocked audiences years before Hitchcock's Psycho pulled the same trick. Christopher Lee, already carving his reputation with Hammer, exudes menace even when he's not on screen, like the town itself is an extension of his will. It barely made noise at the box office, dwarfed by historical epics and Hollywood musicals. But its influence lingers, inspiring countless foggy New England nightmares. Watch it, and you'll never trust a roadside inn again. Tormented, 1960. A seaside romance gone wrong, or a supernatural curse in disguise. Tormented opens with a jazz pianist standing on a lighthouse island haunted by the drowned ghost of his former lover. What begins as guilt soon turns into full-blown terror as her spectral presence stalks him, whispering accusations, showing up in photographs, and even appearing as a disembodied hand clutching at his shoulder. Director Burt Gordon, often nicknamed Mr. B.I.G. for his giant monster films, shifted gears here into pure ghostly dread. The film uses its island setting brilliantly, isolating the protagonist not just physically, but mentally, cutting him off from escape. The sea becomes a character in itself, always rumbling, always threatening to cough up the past he wants to bury. While the effects may look quaint now, superimposed phantoms, glowing apparitions, the film's power lies in its psychological edge. The ghost isn't just a figure of horror, but a mirror for the pianist's own crumbling conscience. Every time she appears, you're left asking, is this real, or is guilt eating him alive? Tormented was made for drive-in double bills and didn't stand a chance against prestige pictures of the era. Yet in its own lean, eerie way, it foreshadowed the rise of supernatural thrillers where personal flaws invite the ghosts in. It's a low-budget gem that proves sometimes all you need is fog, surf, and regret to create terror. The Innocents, 1961. A candle flickers in a cavernous hallway. A whisper of laughter echoes down the corridor. Deborah Kerr, clutching her lantern, peers into the shadows, and suddenly she isn't sure if she's protecting children or being hunted by them. That's The Innocents, one of the most chilling films of the 1960s and a masterclass in atmosphere. Adapted from Henry James's novella The Turn of the Screw, the story follows a governess convinced that two angelic children are being manipulated by sinister forces. Director Jack Clayton leaned into ambiguity, giving audiences no easy answers. Are there really ghosts of the previous caretakers, or is the governess spiraling into delusion? The beauty of the film is how it never tells you outright. It makes you squirm in the uncertainty. Cinematographer Freddie Francis used CinemaScope lenses with gauze over the glass to give everything a misty, dreamlike look, as if the house itself is a trap. The sound design turns silence into menace. Every creak and breath feels deliberate, like the mansion is listening. Though praised critically, it never became a box office titan. Big studio spectacles were flooding screens, and subtle, quiet horror didn't stand a chance. But in the decades since, The Innocents has earned its crown as one of the greatest ghost stories ever filmed. Its restraint is its weapon, and the final act leaves you rattled long after the credits fade. Mr. Sardonicus, 1961. William Castle wasn't just a director, he was a showman. Known for wiring seats with buzzers and handing out gimmicky props, he always had a trick up his sleeve. But with Mr. Sardonicus, Castle delivered one of his darkest tales, a gothic chiller that combined grotesque imagery with a twisted sense of audience participation. The plot? A man obsessed with greed digs up his father's grave to steal winnings from a lottery ticket. But in doing so, he unleashes a curse that leaves his face permanently frozen in a ghastly grin. From there, it becomes a macabre spiral of cruelty, medical horror, and haunting spectacle. Castle famously introduced the punishment poll, where audiences were asked to vote with glow-in-the-dark cards on whether Mr. Sardonicus should be shown mercy or meet a gruesome end. Of course, Castle later admitted only one ending was ever filmed, but the stunt worked, cementing the movie's reputation as one of his boldest. The film itself, shot in moody black and white, pushes atmosphere over gore. The image of Sardonicus, with his rictus face stretching into an eternal sneer, is pure nightmare fuel. Add to that a score that screeches and swoons at just the right moments, and you have a film that burrows under your skin. It wasn't a mainstream hit, but it showcased Castle's genius. Horror isn't just about what's on the screen, but how you make the audience feel like part of the terror. Carnival of Souls, 1962. You've seen dream logic in movies, but few films embrace it as completely as Carnival of Souls. Made for just $30,000 by industrial filmmaker Herc Harvey, it tells the story of a young organist who survives a car accident, only to find herself pursued by pale, silent figures and drawn to an abandoned carnival pavilion. Shot in Salt Lake City and the eerie ruins of the Saltaire amusement park, the film drips with unease. Every frame feels slightly off, daylight looks too bright, shadows linger too long, and people move just a little strangely. The effect is hypnotic, like being trapped in a waking dream. Candice Hilligoss, in the lead role, plays it with a detached, almost sleepwalking performance that makes you wonder if she's alive at all. Harvey, directing his only feature, leaned into guerrilla techniques, using real locations, stealing shots without permits, and recording sound later to stretch the tiny budget. The result feels raw and uncanny, adding to its unsettling tone. At the time, drive-in audiences mostly shrugged it off, preferring more polished studio horror. But decades later, Carnival of Souls became a cult classic, praised by directors like George A. Romero and David Lynch for its haunting atmosphere. It's not about jump scares, it's about the slow, creeping realization that something is deeply, irreversibly wrong. Once you've seen those ghoulish figures dancing in the carnival's empty halls, they'll follow you into your dreams. Burn, witch, burn. Night of the Eagle, 1962. Picture a stuffy college professor rolling his eyes at superstition, then realizing his career, his marriage, and maybe even his life are being held together by spells he doesn't believe in. That's the slow burn terror of Burn, Witch, Burn, released in the U.S. as Night of the Eagle. Adapted from Fritz Leiber's novel Conjure Wife, it follows Norman Taylor, a psychology professor who discovers that his wife has been practicing protective witchcraft in secret. Scoffing at the idea, he forces her to destroy her charms and talismans. What follows is a cascade of eerie accidents, threats, and shadows, leaving Norman to question whether his rational mind can survive forces beyond logic. Director Sidney Hayers amps up the paranoia with clever visuals. An owl statue suddenly looms alive. A classroom blackboard scrawls messages that no hand has written. A chase through the college at night is lit with jagged, high-contrast angles that make the ordinary hallways feel like a labyrinth of menace. Unlike Hammer's Gothic spectacles, this one goes for modern realism. The horror is rooted in the clash between skepticism and belief, turning academia into a battleground for the unseen. British censors initially worried the film was too grim, but its intelligence won critics over, even as it failed to grab the mass audience that craved colorful Hammer vampires. The real legacy of Burn, Witch, Burn, is how it influenced later stories of rational people forced to confront the irrational. It's smart, stylish, and sinister, a supernatural thriller where the scariest thing is realizing knowledge may not be enough to save you. The Haunting, 1963. Forget CGI and jump scares. Robert Wise's The Haunting proves that what you don't see can be scarier than anything splattered on screen. Based on Shirley Jackson's novel The Haunting of Hill House, it's the story of Eleanor, a lonely woman drawn into an investigation of a famously cursed mansion. The brilliance of this film lies in its restraint. The walls don't need to bleed when the wallpaper can seem to breathe. Doors don't need to slam when the sound of knocking, just off-screen, never explained, can rattle the audience's imagination. Wise used wide-angle lenses to warp the mansion's interiors, making corridors bulge and tilt as if the house itself were alive. Julie Harris, playing Eleanor, gives the performance of her career. She's fragile, vulnerable, and slowly unraveling as the house exploits her isolation. Claire Bloom's Theo provides a sharp counterpoint, suspicious of everything, while Richard Johnson as Dr. Markway tries to keep the scientific experiment under control. But in the end, Hill House makes its own rules. The film wasn't a massive box office smash, overshadowed by bigger spectacles of the early 60s. But its reputation has only grown. Stephen King called it one of the most important haunted house films ever made, and modern horror owes much of its slow-burn dread to Wise's masterclass in subtle terror. In short, you never see a ghost directly, yet you leave the movie convinced the house itself is still whispering in your ear. The Terror, 1963. Jack Nicholson wandering a crumbling castle, Boris Karloff muttering incantations, and Roger Corman shooting with leftover sets. Welcome to The Terror, a film that's part Gothic nightmare, part filmmaking dare. Legend has it, Corman wrapped shooting on The Raven, but still had access to elaborate castle sets and Karloff under contract. Rather than waste the opportunity, he shot extra footage, then patched together a story later. Nicholson, still years from stardom, plays a French officer who stumbles upon a mysterious woman near a haunted estate, only to become entangled in a supernatural plot. The result? A fever dream of mismatched scenes, reshoots by multiple directors, including Francis Ford Coppola in his early days, and a plot that never quite fits together. And yet, the atmosphere is undeniable. The decaying halls drip with menace, the seaside cliffs crash like a warning, and Karloff, even past his prime, radiates gravitas as a cursed nobleman. Audiences in 1963 weren't impressed, it was dismissed as a patchwork quickie. But over time, The Terror has become a fascinating artifact of low-budget ingenuity. It captures the improvisational energy of Corman's studio, where resourcefulness was the true special effect. Is it polished? Not even close. But watch Nicholson navigating misty forests and Karloff commanding candlelit chambers, and you'll see why even a mess from this era can feel richer than half the slick horrors pumped out today. The Kiss of the Vampire, 1963. Hammer Films built its empire on Gothic horror, and while Dracula was their crown jewel, The Kiss of the Vampire proved they could deliver terror without leaning on Christopher Lee. The story begins with a couple stranded at a Bavarian inn, lured into the clutches of a sinister aristocratic family with vampiric appetites. It's Hammer through and through, lush color cinematography, lavish sets, and costumes that drip with sinister elegance. But this time, the focus isn't on a single villain, but an entire cult of blood drinkers. Director Don Sharp leaned heavily into atmosphere, crafting dinner parties that feel like traps and landscapes that seem poisoned by secrets. The score swells dramatically as coffins crack open, bats swarm, and rituals unfold with almost theatrical flair. Behind the scenes, the production had to cut corners. The bat effects were often clumsy, leading to a few unintended laughs, but the sheer Gothic commitment keeps it chilling. The film even dared to feature a female vampire cult leader, a bold move for its time, giving the story a fresh twist on the familiar Hammer formula. Though overshadowed by the studio's bigger Dracula titles, The Kiss of the Vampire carved out a reputation as one of Hammer's most stylish secondary offerings. Critics today see it as proof that Hammer's magic wasn't tied to one franchise. It was about creating a world where elegance and dread walked hand in hand. This one reminds us: never accept dinner invitations from strangers in Gothic Europe. The Old Dark House, 1963. A remake of James Whale's 1932 classic, The Old Dark House, could have been a disaster. Instead, it became a quirky, eerie experiment, a haunted house tale filtered through William Castle's showmanship. Castle, famous for gimmicks like Percepto and Emergo, didn't wire up seats this time. Instead, he leaned into dark humor and Gothic style. The story follows a group of stranded travelers seeking refuge in a creepy mansion, only to find themselves tangled with a bizarre family and their deadly secrets. While not as faithful or frightening as the original, Castle's version injects a strange charm. The sets are pure Gothic excess, shadowy staircases, secret passages, and candlelit dining rooms that seem to stretch into forever. The family members themselves are so eccentric they blur the line between comedy and menace, keeping the audience uneasy about whether to laugh or shiver. What held it back was timing. By 1963, horror fans were expecting Hammer's lavish blood or Hitchcock's sharp precision. Castle's remake felt caught in between, too stylized for serious horror, too grim for pure camp. It didn't light up the box office, but it kept the Old Dark House subgenre alive for future filmmakers. Seen today, it's an oddball delight. You can feel Castle experimenting, trying to fuse his carnival barker instincts with true Gothic chills. The result is uneven but fascinating, a forgotten relic of an era when haunted houses were still allowed to be a little playful. Castle of Blood, 1964. Step into a castle where the only guests are the dead, and they want you to stay forever. Castle of Blood stars the queen of Gothic horror herself, Barbara Steele, in one of the most atmospheric supernatural chillers of the 1960s. The setup is irresistible. A skeptical journalist accepts a bet to spend the night in a haunted castle on All Souls' Eve. What begins as curiosity quickly curdles into dread as he encounters figures who seem alive, only to reveal themselves as restless spirits. Steele, with her otherworldly eyes and haunted presence, glides through the corridors like she belongs to both the living and the dead. The film, though an Italian production originally, was distributed heavily in the UK and US markets, marketed as a macabre import dripping with Gothic allure. Its black and white cinematography makes every candlelit hall feel infinite, and its spectral apparitions appear with chilling patience, never rushed, as if they know you can't escape anyway. At the box office, it was crushed by bigger, flashier spectacles, dismissed as just another Gothic programmer. But over time, horror fans rediscovered it as one of the great haunted castle films, rich in mood and fatalistic terror. It's the kind of movie that doesn't just tell a ghost story, it convinces you you're already part of it. If you think one night in a haunted house is just a dare, this film proves some dares never end. The Skull, 1965. What's scarier than a haunted house? Try a haunted object, the skull of the Marquis de Sade, cursed and brimming with evil. That's the premise of The Skull, a chilling Amicus production starring Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee, the dynamic duo of British horror. Directed by Freddie Francis, the film follows Cushing's character as he acquires the infamous skull and slowly falls under its malignant influence. No vampires, no ghosts, just a simple, sinister relic that oozes corruption. Scenes of Cushing trapped in surreal, dreamlike sequences, surrounded by invisible forces, elevate the film into something stranger than its modest setup suggests. The skull itself is never flashy. It doesn't sprout fangs or leap at its victims. Instead, its power is conveyed through atmosphere, glowing lights, suffocating silence, and sudden bursts of violence. Francis, a master of mood, stretches tension until even the smallest movement feels dangerous. Though it wasn't a box office giant, The Skull demonstrated Amicus's ability to compete with Hammer by focusing on psychological unease instead of gothic grandeur. It's often overlooked in Cushing's filmography, but fans who revisit it find an unsettling meditation on obsession and possession. Bottom line, sometimes the scariest thing isn't a monster in the shadows. It's an object staring at you from the mantel, daring you to touch it. Dr. Terror's House of Horrors, 1965. Before Creepshow and Tales from the Crypt, there was Dr. Terror's House of Horrors, the anthology that kicked off Amicus's long run of horror portmanteaus. Peter Cushing, buried under wild makeup and prosthetics, plays Dr. Schreck, a fortune-teller whose tarot cards reveal terrifying fates for 5 fellow train passengers. Each story delivers a different flavor of supernatural dread. There's a killer plant that won't stop growing, a werewolf tale dripping with gothic atmosphere, a disembodied hand that won't stay buried, a painter cursed with deadly visions, and a vampire twist that pulls the rug out from under smug expectations. Each vignette has its own bite, but together they form a creepy, unpredictable ride. What made this film stand out wasn't just the stories, it was the cast. Alongside Cushing, you've got Christopher Lee, Donald Sutherland, and Roy Castle, all lending credibility and charisma. Director Freddie Francis, once again behind the camera, keeps the pace brisk, never lingering too long on any one horror. Released in 1965, it wasn't a box office juggernaut, but it laid the foundation for Amicus's reputation as the kings of horror anthologies. The format influenced decades of TV and film, from Night Gallery to modern-day horror series. It's a reminder that sometimes the scariest trip isn't the one you buy a ticket for. It's the one you never asked to board. Quatermass and the Pit, 1967. Few films of the 1960s blended science fiction and supernatural terror as seamlessly as Quatermass and the Pit. Known in the U.S. as 5 Million Years to Earth, it begins with archaeologists uncovering strange objects in a London subway construction site. At first, they think it's unexploded war ordnance, but what they've really unearthed is far more ancient and far more terrifying. The discovery unleashes visions of the past, spectral hauntings, and psychic disturbances that grip the city. The twist? The force beneath London may be both alien and demonic in nature, blurring the line between science and the supernatural. For audiences in the 60s, this mix of speculative science with gothic terror was groundbreaking. Hammer poured more budget into this installment than earlier entries, and it shows. The practical effects, creatures, explosions, and ghostly energy storms still carry weight decades later. But what lingers isn't the spectacle. It's the concept that humanity itself might have been shaped by an ancient evil buried beneath our feet. The film did decently in the UK, but was overshadowed internationally by glossier genre spectacles. Today, though, it's hailed as one of Hammer's finest achievements, part haunted city story, part cosmic horror, and all unnerving. It leaves you with the chilling thought, what else lies buried under our cities, waiting to wake up? The Sorcerers, 1967. Boris Karloff's late career was filled with oddities, but The Sorcerers may be the most underrated. Here, he plays an aging hypnotist who invents a device that lets him experience the sensations of a younger man. At first, it seems like harmless escapism, but soon he and his wife begin controlling the youth's actions, pushing him into increasingly violent and reckless behavior. The supernatural element isn't cloaks and castles, but mind control, a horror rooted in the loss of free will. Director Michael Reeves, who would later make the cult classic Witchfinder General, brings an almost documentary style to the London settings, grounding the outlandish premise in stark realism. The contrast between Karloff's weary gravitas and the chaos he unleashes makes the story all the more disturbing. The film is also a snapshot of late 60s Britain, blending swinging youth culture with gothic dread. Nightclubs pulse with energy, only to be invaded by sinister forces pulling the strings. The horror isn't in monsters, but in what people do when they can live vicariously through someone else's body. The Sorcerers never made big waves commercially, but critics have since praised it as a sharp, unsettling take on control, corruption, and the hunger for lost youth. It's a haunting swan song for Karloff, proving he could still dominate the screen even as the horror genre evolved around him. It asks the question, what's scarier, losing your life or losing your will to live it? Outro 74 words. So there you have it, 15 supernatural horrors from the 1960s that slipped through the cracks while blockbusters hogged the spotlight. They didn't have massive budgets or endless marketing, but what they did have was atmosphere, imagination, and the power to haunt your dreams long after the credits rolled. Which of these forgotten gems will you track down first? Drop your pick in the comments, hit subscribe, and share with fellow horror fans, because the crypt never closes. They told us the 70s belonged to the big dogs. Jaws was swallowing theaters whole. Star Wars launched people into space. And The Exorcist kept everyone talking. But while the world was busy chasing blockbusters, a different breed of horror was hiding in the shadows. Strange, haunting films that dared to go their own way. So, are you ready to dig up 13 supernatural nightmares that slipped through the cracks? Let's start in the shadows of Collinwood. House of Dark Shadows, 1970. Imagine a soap opera with vampires, coffins, and blood running down the staircases, then crank it up to the big screen. That was House of Dark Shadows, Dan Curtis's gothic shocker spun off from his hit TV series. In 1970, when audiences were glued to the glossy family dramas of Love Story and Airport, Curtis dropped a hammer blow of gothic gloom, dragging daytime television into a cinematic graveyard. Shot on location at the Lyndhurst Mansion in New York, the film had no interest in holding your hand. Barnabas Collins, played by Jonathan Frid, wasn't your charming Dracula knockoff. He was a tragic figure cursed to feed, forever trapped in doomed romance. And unlike the TV show, the film didn't shy away from intensity. Curtis pushed his actors to embrace fear, running long takes in dim candlelight and letting every shadow whisper doom. The movie shocked fans of the soap by piling on what the television format couldn't. Corpses stacked, bodies fell, and Barnabas's hunger was never glossed over. That rawness split fans, some loving the heightened stakes, others missing the slow-burn gothic romance of the small screen. Still, it delivered something television never could, a feature-length gothic horror dripping with atmosphere. But here's the catch. House of Dark Shadows arrived the same year as Airport and MASH. Against those giants, its cult impact barely registered. Yet its shadow is long. Without it, you don't get the revival craze of Gothic TV or the later obsession with doomed vampires. This wasn't a blockbuster. This was a candlelit nightmare for anyone willing to sit through the storm. Cry of the Banshee, 1970. Vincent Price was already the king of Gothic horror by 1970, but Cry of the Banshee proved he still had more tricks up his sleeve. Set in Elizabethan England, but filmed with all the grit of a 70s exploitation flick, this supernatural tale blended witchcraft panic with full-blown vengeance from beyond the grave. Price plays a sadistic magistrate who leads witch hunts in the countryside. But when his cruelty goes too far, the so-called outcasts summon something older, darker, and much less forgiving. What follows is not your polished studio horror. Instead, director Gordon Hessler drenched the film in grime, dirt, and unshakable atmosphere. The countryside looks less like a fairy tale and more like a haunted wasteland where every shadow carries a curse. Fun fact: the Abai title sequence wasn't your usual painted credits. It came courtesy of none other than Terry Gilliam, years before Monty Python and Time Bandits made him a household name. His surreal animated opening set the tone for a story where reality cracked under the weight of superstition. But the real punch came from Price himself. While critics at the time thought he was going through the motions, modern reappraisal shows a performance layered with arrogance, fear, and just a touch of doomed humanity. It's not his most famous role, but it is one of his most unsettling. Released in the same year as Patton and Love Story, Cry of the Banshee was never going to compete. Yet decades later, it feels like a hidden bridge between the Gothic past and the harsher, more violent direction horror would take in the coming years. A banshee's cry, lost in the noise of the box office, still echoing today. Something Evil, 1972. Before Steven Spielberg took the world by storm with Jaws and Close Encounters, he quietly dipped his toe into supernatural horror with a made-for-TV gem called Something Evil. Most people missed it, and that's a shame, because hidden under its television budget was a young director sharpening his knives on atmosphere and dread. The story follows a young couple, played by Darren McGavin and Sandy Dennis, who move into a farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania. At first, everything looks like a Hallmark postcard: rolling fields, fresh air, a perfect place to start anew. But almost immediately, the house seems wrong. Red goo oozes from jars, voices whisper in the night, and a local farmer warns that the land itself might be cursed. Spielberg leaned on his growing instinct for suspense, shooting wide fields where something unseen always seems ready to creep in. He made clever use of sound. A baby's cries twisted into something unnatural, silence stretched until you wanted to scream. And while the TV censors clipped the wings of what he could show, Spielberg proved you didn't need big effects to leave your audience rattled. Something Evil aired on CBS and then basically vanished. No theatrical release, no cultural footprint. It was overshadowed by Spielberg's own rise to fame just a few years later. But revisiting it now, you see flashes of the filmmaker who would terrify the world with a shark and dazzle them with aliens. This wasn't blockbuster Spielberg. This was raw Spielberg, experimenting in the haunted farmhouse of television. And for anyone who digs through the vaults, it's a reminder that even the biggest directors once tested their fear tactics on small, forgotten stages. The Boy Who Cried Werewolf, 1973. Universal Pictures had a long history with werewolves, but by the 70s, the classic monster had lost its bite. Then came The Boy Who Cried Werewolf in 1973, a strange little supernatural thriller that tried to update the legend for a new generation. It didn't change horror history, but it delivered one of the decade's oddest, most overlooked takes on lycanthropy. The story centers on a boy who witnesses his father being attacked and cursed by a werewolf. When the transformation begins, the boy desperately tries to warn everyone around him, but no one believes him. What plays out is less about snarling beasts and more about the paranoia of being the only one who sees the truth. Imagine The Boy Who Cried Wolf, but with fur and claws. Directed by Nathan H. Juran, best known for fantasy epics like The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, the film embraced its low-budget charm. The werewolf makeup wasn't cutting-edge even for the time, but it had a scrappy effectiveness. Juran kept the camera tight on the boy's terrified reactions, letting fear do the heavy lifting. The result is a film that feels both campy and strangely sincere. Critics weren't impressed, and audiences barely noticed. Released the same year as The Exorcist, it never stood a chance. But the film has a weird staying power. Fans of vintage monster flicks often stumble across it and appreciate its earnestness. It wasn't trying to reinvent the wheel. It was trying to tell a small, sad story about a boy who knows his dad is doomed, and no one listens. The Boy Who Cried Werewolf may not be a blockbuster, but it's a fascinating footnote in Universal's long history with monsters. A howl lost in the noise of the decade, but one that still echoes if you listen closely enough. Symptoms, 1974. For decades, Symptoms was a ghost itself, a British supernatural drama thought lost until a copy resurfaced in the early 2000s. Directed by José Ramón Larraz, it is one of the most hauntingly atmospheric films of the 70s, a psychological descent into madness dressed up like a ghost story. Angela Pleasance, daughter of Donald Pleasance, stars as Helen, a fragile young woman who invites a friend to stay with her at a countryside manor. At first, it looks like a picture-perfect Gothic setup: lonely mansion, wind howling through the trees, a nervous hostess who seems a little too tightly wound. But then the cracks start showing. Whispers of a missing woman, echoes of footsteps in empty corridors, and Helen's gradual unraveling leave the audience wondering if we are watching hauntings or hallucinations. Larraz was known for blending horror with psychological unease, and here he let silence and stillness do the heavy lifting. The camera lingers just a little too long on faces, mirrors, and doorways, suggesting the presence of something unseen. Angela Pleasance's pale, otherworldly performance sells it completely. She looks like a woman forever standing on the edge of collapse. Symptoms was the official British entry at the Cannes Film Festival in 1974, yet it barely made a ripple outside art house circles. The Exorcist and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre were consuming the spotlight, leaving little space for quiet, unnerving pieces like this. Over time, it slipped away into obscurity, surviving only in rumor until its rediscovery. Watching it today, you realize how ahead of its time it was. Symptoms isn't about jump scares, it's about the terror of isolation, repression, and the mind's ability to conjure horrors worse than any ghost. It's proof that sometimes the scariest hauntings don't need monsters at all, just a lonely house and a woman who can't escape her own head. Beyond the Door, 1974. When The Exorcist became a sensation, it was only a matter of time before international filmmakers tried their hand at possession stories. Enter Beyond the Door, an Italian-American co-production that took the idea of demonic forces and cranked the surrealism to 11. Released in 1974, it was marketed as Italy's answer to The Exorcist, but it ended up being something stranger, campier, and far more unpredictable. Juliette Mills, known mostly for wholesome roles, shocked audiences by playing a San Francisco woman whose pregnancy takes a terrifying turn. The child inside her may not be entirely human, and her EDOS transformation includes twisting voices, grotesque visions, and episodes that leave her family in shock. Director Ovidio G. Asinitis wasn't chasing subtlety. He wanted spectacle, and he delivered it with gusto. The film is full of bizarre touches, walls bleeding, heads spinning in unnatural ways, and voices echoing from nowhere. But unlike The Exorcist, Beyond the Door leans heavily into dreamlike imagery. At times, it feels like a psychedelic trip gone wrong, with camera angles that disorient and sound design that rattles your nerves. Critics at the time tore it apart as a cheap knockoff, but audiences didn't care. The movie pulled in millions at the box office, becoming one of the highest-grossing Italian horrors of the decade. Of course, Warner Brothers wasn't thrilled. The studio sued, claiming it was a rip-off of The Exorcist. The lawsuit dragged on but didn't stop the film from gaining cult status. For horror fans, Beyond the Door became infamous, too wild to ignore, too odd to dismiss. Today, it stands as a perfect example of 70s Euro horror. Over the top, stylish, and unafraid to throw logic out the window for sheer atmosphere. It may never rival The Exorcist in Polish, but it beats it in sheer audacity. Sometimes being a little unhinged is what makes a film unforgettable. House of Mortal Sin, 1976. By the mid-70s, British director Pete Walker had built a reputation for pushing boundaries. With House of Mortal Sin, also known as The Confessional, he aimed his sights on guilt, fear, and power. The result is one of his most chilling supernatural thrillers, a film that burrowed into audiences with its eerie atmosphere and unsettling central figure. The story follows Jenny, a young woman who turns to her local priest for guidance. But this priest, played with unnerving intensity by Anthony Sharp, is hiding something twisted beneath his pious exterior. Obsessed with punishing sin, he begins a descent into paranoia and control, blurring the line between spiritual duty and obsession. The atmosphere grows heavier with every scene, turning confession into a trap instead of a release. Walker shot the film in real British churches and rectories, giving it a grounded, lived-in feel. The candlelit interiors, echoing hallways, and claustrophobic confessionals make the setting itself feel haunted. And while the story isn't filled with elaborate effects, it thrives on unease, the sense that trust in authority can be turned against you in terrifying ways. Critics were divided. Some dismissed it as sensational, while others praised it for confronting the dark side of moral authority. But when released in 1976, it was drowned out by bigger horrors like Carrie and The Omen. Walker's smaller, slower, deeply unnerving tale couldn't compete with Hollywood spectacle. Looking back, House of Mortal Sin has aged surprisingly well. It's less about overt scares and more about the kind of psychological dread that sticks in your chest. A film where every whispered word in a confessional feels like a secret you should never have spoken aloud. Ruby, 1977. In 1977, audiences got something they weren't expecting. A gangster ghost story wrapped in Southern Gothic mood. Ruby starred Piper Laurie, fresh off her Oscar-nominated turn in Carrie, playing a woman haunted not only by her past, but by forces that refused to let her go. The story begins in 1935 when Ruby's mobster lover is executed in front of her. Fast forward 16 years, and she's running a drive-in theater in the swamps with her mute daughter. But the past isn't buried. Strange occurrences begin to unravel her life, and soon it's clear that her dead lover isn't resting peacefully. Director Curtis Harrington leaned heavily into atmosphere. The drive-in setting was inspired, blending Americana nostalgia with creeping unease. Imagine watching a movie under the stars while the real horror creeps around behind the screen. Piper Laurie delivers a performance both flamboyant and tragic, channeling a woman whose grief curdled into something dangerous. The supernatural elements, ghostly voices, possessions, and violent outbursts were blended with classic gangster revenge tropes, creating a genre mashup that felt entirely unique. Critics didn't know what to make of it, and audiences were too distracted by juggernauts like Star Wars and Close Encounters of the Third Kind to notice. Yet Ruby carved out a cult reputation on late-night TV, where its swampy atmosphere and theatrical performances found fans. Today, it's remembered as one of Harrington's most distinctive works and a rare supernatural horror led by a woman both commanding and vulnerable. Ruby may not have rewritten horror history, but it's a reminder that the 70s weren't just about demons and haunted houses. Sometimes the past itself comes back to claim you, and it doesn't matter how far you run. Alucarda, 1977. If you've ever wondered what would happen if Gothic horror met a fever dream, Alucarda is the answer. Directed by Mexican filmmaker Juan López Moctezuma, this is one of the strangest, most visually intense supernatural horrors of the decade. Released in 1977, it was shot almost entirely in convent ruins, and every frame looks like it was carved from nightmare. The story begins when a young orphan, Justine, arrives at a convent and befriends the wild, mysterious Alucarda. From the start, Alucarda feels different, like she's carrying something dark in her soul. Soon, strange events erupt around her, whispers in corridors, unexplained apparitions, and an atmosphere that grows heavier with every passing day. As their friendship deepens, so does the pull of supernatural forces, leading to possessions, violent outbursts, and scenes that blur the line between reality and hallucination. What sets Alucarda apart isn't just its plot, but its style. Moctezuma, who once worked with surrealist master Alejandro Jodorowsky, filled the film with wild, surreal imagery. Blood runs down white walls, characters scream with operatic intensity, and the editing feels almost dreamlike. It's chaotic, excessive, and unforgettable. At the time, critics didn't know what to make of it. Some dismissed it as exploitation, while others were unsettled by its sheer intensity. Audiences were more focused on mainstream hits like Close Encounters of the Third Kind, so Alucarda slipped into cult obscurity. But over the years, its reputation has grown. Horror fans now celebrate it as one of the boldest supernatural visions of the 70s. Alucarda isn't a film that eases you in. It grabs you by the throat and drags you into its fever dream. Love it or hate it, you don't forget it, and in a decade crowded with safe horror, that's what makes it stand out. The Child, 1977. Sometimes the smallest budgets produce the biggest chills. The Child, released in 1977, is a low-budget American supernatural film that feels like it was dug out of a nightmare. It may not have the polish of The Omen or Carrie, but its eerie atmosphere makes it unforgettable. The story centers on a young woman hired to care for a strange little girl named Rosalie. At first, Rosalie seems quiet and withdrawn, but soon it becomes clear that she has a horrifying secret. She can control the dead, and when she gets angry, the earth itself answers her call, sending shambling corpses to do her bidding. Director Robert Voskanian had barely any money to work with, but he turned that limitation into a strength. The film was shot in rural California, using abandoned farmhouses and cemeteries as natural sets. The result is a movie that feels raw, almost documentary-like in its realism. The zombie sequences, while crude by today's standards, are staged with such intensity that they stick in your head long after the credits roll. What makes The Child truly unsettling is the little girl at its center. Rosalie isn't a typical horror villain. She's quiet, almost sympathetic, yet her power is terrifying. The film plays on the fear of innocence gone wrong, echoing the creepy child trope that defined much of 70s horror. The Child never saw wide release and was quickly overshadowed by bigger hits of the year. But for those who stumbled across it on VHS or late-night TV, it became a hidden treasure. It's not polished, it's not perfect, but it's a film that proves atmosphere and imagination can go further than money ever could. So there you have it, 13 supernatural nightmares from the 70s that blockbuster mania tried to bury. While the world lined up for sharks, spaceships, and telekinetic teens, These films whispered in the shadows, daring anyone brave enough to listen. Which of these hidden classics will you track down first? Drop your pick in the comments, share this list with your fellow horror fans, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into cinema's dark corners. Until next time, keep your lights on and your curiosity sharp. The 1970 seconds were a golden age for horror. While sharks, space battles, and possessed children dominated the headlines, a stranger story was happening in the shadows. Studios quietly buried films that were too eerie, too experimental, or just too far ahead of their time. These supernatural nightmares slipped past the mainstream, but they still leave chills decades later. So, are you ready to step off the blockbuster path and unearth the hidden classics that streaming forgot? Let's scare Jessica to death. 1971. Picture this: a quiet farmhouse surrounded by apple orchards, mist rolling across a lake, and the faint sound of church bells. It looks like peace, right? Not in Let's Scare Jessica to Death. What starts as a fresh start for a fragile woman turns into one of the decade's most unnerving ghost stories. Jessica, played with delicate intensity by Zora Lampert, has just left a mental hospital. She wants a simple life with her husband and friends in the countryside, but every creak of the old house, every strange glance from the locals whispers something darker. The film drips with paranoia, making you question if Jessica's mind is breaking again or if something ancient is lurking in the water nearby. Director John Hancock had barely $1 million to spend, so he leaned on atmosphere. Hidden speakers piped eerie sounds onto the set to keep the cast genuinely unsettled. That nervous energy translated straight onto the screen. Critics dismissed it at the time, but over the years, its influence has grown. Indie horror films like The Blair Witch Project owe plenty to Jessica's creeping sense of dread. This is not a jump-scare roller coaster, it's a slow drip of unease that seeps into your bones. The result? A cult classic that still feels strangely modern and unnervingly fragile. You can't easily stream it, but if you track it down, you'll discover why whispers about this film have never fully gone quiet. The Other 1972. Golden sunlight, white picket, fences, and twin boys running through open fields. At first glance, The Other feels like a slice of nostalgic Americana. But stay a while, and you'll see those postcard images twist into something far more chilling. Directed by Robert Mulligan, the same man who gave us To Kill a Mockingbird, The Other follows identical twins, Niles and Holland Perry, on a Connecticut farm. Their games seem innocent until small tragedies start piling up. A toy hidden away, a neighbor's accident, whispers of family secrets. Every scene peels back the surface of small-town life, showing how easily innocence can mask dread. Mulligan filmed the story in sequence, from spring to fall, letting the young actors naturally grow with the narrative. He even slipped fake pages into the script so their reactions would stay authentic when the truth unfolded. Jerry Goldsmith's score starts light and airy, then slowly mutates into something that feels less like a lullaby and more like a funeral march. Audiences in 1972 weren't interested. The Godfather overshadowed everything, and The Other slipped quietly away. But its legacy is undeniable. The creepy child trope that dominated horror for decades owes a heavy debt to Mulligan's twins. What makes this film endure isn't gore or spectacle. It's the slow, suffocating feeling that the picture-perfect family life we admire can rot from the inside. You won't find it on major platforms, but if you ever stumble across it, prepare for a slow dive into pure unease. The Possession of Joel Delaney, 1972. New York City in the early 70 seconds was a glittering skyline sitting on crumbling streets. Into this landscape came The Possession of Joel Delaney, a film that dared to mix the supernatural with the fractures of privilege and class. Shirley MacLaine stars as Nora, a wealthy woman from the Upper East Side whose brother Joel suddenly begins acting strangely. At first it looks like mental collapse, but soon the truth emerges. Joel is overtaken by the vengeful spirit of a man from the city's harsher neighborhoods. What unfolds isn't just a haunting, It's a clash between sheltered wealth and a world it pretends not to see. Director Waris Hussein used handheld 16mm cameras during possession sequences, splicing them against polished studio shots. The result is jagged, jarring, and deeply unsettling. Sound design heightened the discomfort with reversed animal noises warped into human growls, giving Joel's breakdowns an uncanny edge. The movie was released opposite The Godfather, which meant it never had a chance at box office glory. Critics were unsettled by its bleak tone, but modern viewers see something braver. Strip away the rotary phones and bell-bottoms, and what you have is a chilling mirror about how people ignore the struggles around them until it walks right into their living room. The possession of Joel Delaney may not have the fame of The Exorcist, but in its own way, it's sharper, colder, and more grounded in social fear. Too strange to be mainstream, too bold to vanish completely, it's one of the decade's forgotten treasures. Messiah of Evil, 1973. If nightmares had postcards, they'd look like Messiah of Evil. Forget misty castles and European villages. This film plants its horror on the neon-soaked California coast, where beachside sunsets twist into visions of dread. The story follows Arletty, a young woman searching for her missing father in a seaside town where nothing feels right. The locals drift through the streets with blank eyes and slack faces, moving as if under a spell, waiting for something unspeakable. What she uncovers isn't a mystery so much as a waking dream that steadily unravels into terror. Few films capture unease the way this one does. Entire sequences feel like they've been ripped from a half-remembered nightmare. A fluorescent supermarket where aisles stretch into infinity. A movie theater where the audience sits disturbingly silent and lifeless. A seaside mansion lined with shifting murals that make the walls themselves feel alive. Every frame is drenched in atmosphere. Husband and wife filmmakers Willard Hoyk and Gloria Katz weren't aiming for mainstream thrills. With cinematographer Stephen Katz, they washed scenes in sickly reds and cold blues, creating a palette that feels both hypnotic and suffocating. The sound design added another layer of disorientation, with distorted recordings and ambient noises that made audiences feel trapped inside the characters' hallucinations. Released in 1973, Messiah of Evil was quickly overshadowed by juggernauts like The Exorcist. Critics were baffled, audiences stayed away, and it slipped into obscurity. But over the years, it grew into a cult phenomenon. Directors like Guillermo del Toro have praised it as a forgotten bridge between European art cinema and modern slow-burn horror. Messiah of Evil may never have conquered the mainstream, but once you see it, you'll understand why it endures. It isn't just a horror movie, it's a dream you can't quite shake off, long after waking. The Legend of Hell House, 1973. Before ghost hunting shows filled late-night television, there was The Legend of Hell House, a haunted mansion tale so intense it felt less like entertainment and more like a clinical study in fear. Released in 1973, the film was adapted from Richard Matheson's novel and directed by John Huff, who leaned into atmosphere and psychological tension over cheap tricks. The story follows a group of paranormal investigators locked inside the infamous Belasco House, a sprawling estate with a reputation for swallowing anyone who dares enter. Their mission is simple on paper: prove whether spirits exist. But with electromagnetic equipment buzzing and psychic mediums straining to connect, what begins as research quickly becomes a descent into chaos. The house doesn't just test them, it consumes them. Huff's approach elevated the material beyond campfire scares. Wide-angle lenses bent the geometry of rooms into unsettling shapes, while sound engineers experimented with deep, infrasonic tones that rattled theater seats and unnerved audiences on a physical level. Filming inside a decaying British mansion gave the setting an authenticity that couldn't be faked. The house feels alive, like a predator circling its prey. While audiences of the early 70 seconds turned out modestly, critics admired the intelligence behind the scares. Over the years, the film's reputation grew. Stephen King credited it as a major influence on his own haunted house fiction, and echoes of its style can be found in Poltergeist, The Conjuring, and even Netflix's The Haunting of Hill House. What makes The Legend of Hell House endure is its seriousness. This isn't a carnival ride of slamming doors and cheap shrieks. It's the disturbing suggestion that a structure itself can feed on human weakness. Overshadowed in its own era, the film still stands today as one of the sharpest and most unsettling haunted house classics ever made. The Evil 1978. Every decade has its forgotten gem, and for the 70 seconds, that crown belongs to The Evil. On paper, it looks simple. A psychiatrist and his wife buy a decaying New Mexico mansion with plans to turn it into a rehab center. But the land is cursed, the house is angry, and the basement hides a gateway you definitely don't want to open. Director Gus Triconis had just $700,000 to work with, so he leaned on pure atmosphere. The house wasn't a set, it was a crumbling mansion that looked ready to collapse on its own. That real-world rot seeps into every frame. One sequence still rattles horror fans, a man dragged screaming through the floor by invisible hands long before Hollywood had the budget to make such effects look polished. Here, the rawness makes it hit harder. Richard Crenna, usually known for tough guy roles, plays the lead with surprising vulnerability. Joanna Pettit anchors the story with a sharp performance that balances the supernatural chaos with emotional weight. Supporting actors bring the right amount of grit, grounding the madness in something that feels frighteningly human. The Evil didn't have a chance in 1978, released against bigger horror titles with more marketing muscle. But those who stumbled across it on late-night television or VHS never forgot it. It has since grown into a cult favorite, praised for its scrappy style and relentless set pieces. What makes The Evil stand out today is its unpolished energy. It's rough, unpredictable, and brimming with eerie moments that sneak under your skin. It may not sit beside The Exorcist in the history books, but in many ways, it's scarier, because it feels like something that could happen in your own home. Death Dream 1974. Imagine the doorbell ringing, and your son, buried months ago after Vietnam, walks back into the house. He's pale, silent, and unmistakably wrong. That's the opening of Death Dream, also known as Dead of Night, a 1974 shocker from Bob Clark, the same director who would later bring the world A Christmas Story. This time, though, there are no warm memories, only dread creeping in frame by frame. The story centers on Andy Brooks, a soldier killed in action who inexplicably returns home alive. At first, his family embraces the miracle, but relief quickly curdles into terror. Andy is cold, detached, his skin tinged with an unnatural gray. As days pass, his condition worsens. He withdraws from human connection, his eyes empty, his body craving sustenance no ordinary food can provide. Behind the scenes, a young Tom Savini created the unforgettable makeup. He mixed crushed mothballs into foundation to give Andy's flesh a waxy, lifeless hue that still unsettles viewers. Some sequences were shot guerrilla style in real cemeteries without permits, which meant the actors' unease was genuine, their nervous glances weren't staged. That raw energy bleeds into every frame, making the horror feel uncomfortably real. When it premiered, Death Dream was drowned out by bigger names like The Exorcist. Critics barely looked, and audiences moved on. But over time, the film found its reputation. Beneath the undead story lies a powerful metaphor. Andy isn't simply a monster. He's the embodiment of trauma, of young men who came home from war, changed in ways families couldn't understand. Bleak, slow-burning, and unforgettable, Death Dream doesn't rely on cheap tricks. It asks a scarier question. What if the person who comes home isn't really the same? And what if the war didn't just take them away, it brought something broken back in their place? Burnt Offerings 1976. Vacations are supposed to restore you. In Burnt Offerings, the vacation house restores itself by draining the life out of its tenants. Directed by Dan Curtis, the man behind Dark Shadows, this haunted mansion tale is one of the 70 seconds most underrated chillers. The story follows Marion and Ben Rolfe, played by Karen Black and Oliver Reed, who rent a massive estate for the summer with their young son. The deal seems too good to be true, and of course It Island. As the family moves in, the house begins repairing itself. Shutters gleam, gardens bloom, and the walls grow fresh again, all while the humans inside start to unravel. One of the film's creepiest touches is the chauffeur, a grinning figure from Ben's childhood nightmares who keeps reappearing. Played by Anthony James, his silent stare became a horror image people still talk about decades later. Filming was grueling, done in triple-digit California heat, and Reed's sweat-drenched descent into madness wasn't just acting, it was survival. Bette Davis, then nearly 70, took on the role of the family's elderly aunt and insisted on doing her own stunts, climbing stairs without oxygen support. Director Curtis hid oxygen tanks around the set in case she collapsed. That kind of commitment added a raw edge to the film's already tense atmosphere. Burnt Offerings was overshadowed at the box office by the flashier release of Carrie. But time has been kind. Scholars now see it as a key link between Shirley Jackson-style Gothic horror and modern real estate nightmares like the Amityville Horror. If you've ever felt a house watching you back, Burnt Offerings is proof you weren't imagining it. The Sentinel, 1977. A charming Manhattan brownstone in Brooklyn Heights offered at a suspiciously low price. Sounds like a dream rental, right? Except in The Sentinel, that dream hides a nightmare. Directed by Michael Winner, this supernatural classic turns city living into an urban trap you can't escape. Allison Parker, a model played by Christina Rains, moves into the brownstone, thrilled at the deal, but her new neighbors are off. They seem quirky at first, then unsettling, and finally inhuman. The truth is worse than any leaky faucet. The building sits on a gateway, and Allison is being groomed to serve as its eternal guard. Universal gave the production a solid budget, and it shows. The cast is stacked: Ava Gardner, Burgess Meredith, Christopher Walken, and even a young Jeff Goldblum make appearances. But the film is remembered not for its star power, but for its disturbing finale. Winner controversially used real sideshow performers to portray the damned, sparking debates in film ethics circles that continue today. Visually, the movie is striking. Cinematographer Dick Cretina shot migraine sequences through smeared glass to mimic distorted vision, while the soundtrack blended eerie chants with early synthesizer tones. The result is a constant sensory assault that keeps you on edge. Released the same year as Star Wars, The Sentinel barely made a dent at the box office, but horror fans never forgot it. Its bleak atmosphere and surreal ending have kept it alive as a cult favorite. If haunted houses scare you, this one makes entire city blocks feel cursed. The Manitou, 1978. A woman checks into a San Francisco hospital with what doctors think is a tumor on her neck. But when surgeons cut into it, they find something worse: a fetus. Not a human one, but the reincarnated spirit of an ancient figure. That's the setup for The Manitou, one of the wildest supernatural rides the 70 Seconds ever unleashed. Directed by William Girdler and starring Tony Curtis, the film throws everything at the screen. The practical effects team kept prosthetics refrigerated so they wouldn't melt under studio lights. Air pumps under the actress's skin made the growth pulsate unnaturally. By the final act, hospital rooms transform into deep space as lasers battle spirits. It's over the top, bizarre, and unforgettable. Audiences in 1978 weren't sure how to handle it. Critics laughed at its campy tone, and it barely made back its budget. But decades later, horror fans see it differently. The Manitou is admired for its audacity. It mixes body horror, mysticism, and cosmic spectacle in ways that mainstream horror never dared. Composer Lalo Schifrin delivered one of his strangest scores, fusing haunting chants with electronic flourishes. That soundscape alone could give you goosebumps. And Tony Curtis, usually remembered for lighter roles, throws himself fully into the madness, delivering lines with the conviction of a man battling the impossible. The Manitou isn't elegant, but that's the point. It's messy, chaotic, and alive with ideas. Watching it feels less like following a story and more like tumbling into a fever dream. For fans willing to embrace its weirdness, it remains one of the most unique horror films of its decade. The Medusa Touch, 1978. What if your darkest thoughts didn't just stay in your head, but shattered the world around you? That's the terrifying premise of The Medusa Touch, a British supernatural thriller that dared to go big while most haunted tales stayed small. Richard Burton stars as John Morlar, a bitter novelist with telekinetic powers so destructive they could topple civilizations. Director Jack Gold went all in on spectacle. Special effects wizard John Richardson constructed a 60-foot replica of St. Paul's Cathedral only to blow it apart with 200 pounds of explosives. Bridges collapse, planes crash, and skyscrapers buckle, not from natural disaster, but from one man's fury. Burton, legendary for his volcanic screen presence, rewrote his monologues nightly while sipping vodka disguised in teacups. His gravelly delivery makes Morlar feel less like a villain and more like a doomed prophet. The score adds another layer, with distorted choir recordings that sound both angelic and corrupted, echoing Burton's conflicted character. Released in the UK, the film made a splash, but in the US, it was quickly buried by juggernauts like Halloween. Still, its scale and ambition stood apart. While most supernatural horror stuck to basements and attics, The Medusa Touch asked, what if a single mind could unravel entire nations? It's uneven, sometimes melodramatic, but unforgettable. Watching it now feels strangely current. We're used to superheroes wielding powers that can shake the planet, but here, it's a misanthropic writer who wants nothing more than to burn the world down. Overshadowed by leaner horror, The Medusa Touch remains one of the most daring supernatural visions of its decade. The Brood 1979. Some horrors come from haunted houses. Others come from the people we love. David Cronenberg's The Brood skips ghostly tricks and digs straight into emotional wounds, turning family trauma into physical monsters. The film follows Frank, played by Art Hindle, as he battles for custody of his daughter. His estranged wife, Nola, is under the care of experimental therapist Dr. Raglan, portrayed with icy precision by Oliver Reed. Raglan's therapy technique forces patients to physically manifest their rage. In Nola's case, that rage gives birth to twisted children who act on her anger. Filmed on a lean $1.5 million budget in the freezing Ontario winter, production was brutal. Child actors playing the creatures were stuffed with hot water bottles inside their suits just to survive the cold. Samantha Eggar's infamous climactic scene, involving a grotesque birth, reportedly had crew members gagging behind the camera. Cronenberg, going through a bitter divorce himself, poured every ounce of personal anguish into the film. Audiences in 1979 weren't sure what to think. Alien dominated theaters, and The Brood seemed too strange, too raw. But over time, it found its audience. Martin Scorsese even praised it as one of the most powerful horror films of its era. What makes The Brood endure is its honesty. The monsters aren't just creatures, they're physical embodiments of rage, grief, and broken love. Cronenberg didn't craft a popcorn scare machine. He gave us therapy in its darkest form, a horror film that cuts into wounds we'd rather not touch. It's unsettling, personal, and unforgettable. So there you have it, 12 supernatural nightmares from the 70 seconds that never got the Blockbuster spotlight and still aren't easy to stream. They may not have the polish of big studio hits, but that's exactly what makes them feel alive, raw, eerie, and one step away from reality. Which one of these hidden gems would you dare to track down first? Drop your pick in the comments, share this list with your fellow horror fans, and don't forget to subscribe for more forgotten treasures from cinema's dark vault. Until next time, keep your screen glowing and your nerves steady.